The Forgotten Attic, Part 1, The Unseen Terror. Hello everyone, I am your storyteller, and I am here to guide you through a chilling experience that will keep you on the edge of your seat. This video is not just for entertainment, it's to make you feel the terror of the unknown and the strange forces lurking around us. I know many of you watch to unwind before bed, but tonight, let me take you on a journey that might make you rethink that decision. Before we dive in, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share where you're from and the time you're watching this. Now, get comfortable. The moment I stepped into the attic, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't the structure, I'm a civil engineer. I could identify failing beams or compromised walls. No, this felt different. This massive industrial building had stood abandoned for nearly 3 decades before developers decided to turn it into luxury lofts. My job was simple: inspect, document, and verify the plans. But what I encountered in that attic, it was anything but simple. As the heavy access door slammed shut behind me with an unexpected finality, I felt something change in the air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I could feel it. The air itself was thickening, as if the space was breathing. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the walls were alive. The reinforced concrete attic stretched before me, a maze of thick support beams disappearing into the dark. My flashlight barely carved through the shadows. It seemed as though the darkness itself was resisting the light, clinging to the corners of the room like a living entity. The beam of my flashlight couldn't reach more than 15 feet ahead, though emergency lights mounted on the ceiling should have been enough to illuminate the entire space. 3 of them flickered, casting more shadows than light, and the rest remained eerily dark. As I looked at the plans in my hand, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. This level wasn't even supposed to exist. The blueprints showed only a crawl space, not the vast, concrete labyrinth I stood in now. I checked my phone, expecting at least a weak signal. Of course, there was none. The concrete walls, reinforced with 18 inches of solid concrete above and below, blocked any attempt at communication. My colleagues weren't expecting me back for hours, and the construction crew had already left for the day. The developers had insisted that this inspection be completed today, so I was completely alone in this massive, decaying building. As I walked further, I began to notice the temperature. It was unnaturally cold. Even though it was late summer and the lower floors were sweltering without air conditioning, the attic felt as though it were caught in the grip of winter. My breath fogged in front of me, and I began documenting the temperature and structural integrity of the ceiling. The digital thermometer in my bag read 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Impossible for an enclosed space in August. I made a note, attributing it to some quirk in the airflow or the thermal properties of the concrete. Half an hour into my inspection, I stumbled upon something that wasn't on the plans: a narrow corridor. It was wedged between 2 massive concrete support walls, barely wide enough for my shoulders to pass through. Unlike the vast, open attic, this passage was enclosed with a low ceiling that forced me to duck. But the moment I stepped into it, something changed. The air around me vibrated, but not like any sound or machinery I had ever heard. It was a frequency just below hearing, a pressure that made my eardrums throb. My teeth began to feel loose in their sockets, and I couldn't shake the sensation that the walls were closing in on me. The corridor stretched ahead, and at each end stood identical metal doors. Their surfaces were covered in rust patterns that resembled intricate circuit boards or ancient symbols. As I stared, the door to my left creaked open slightly, then slowly closed again, without any draft, without any explanation. The air was completely still, save for that constant, unnerving vibration. I approached the door cautiously, running my hand over the surface. The rust was strange. It didn't flake off, it came away in fine red powder, like dried blood, staining my fingers. My equipment showed no airflow, no temperature difference to explain the movement of the door. I made a mental note to recommend replacing these doors during renovation, but deep down, I felt an unease. Something told me the developers would just seal off this entire corridor, hide it from view. That's when I heard it, a soft scraping sound behind me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. At first, I thought it was the creaking of the old structure settling. But then, it came again. Closer this time. My flashlight flickered, casting jittery shadows, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I spun around, expecting to see nothing but empty space. But as I turned, I saw it, faint, moving figures in the corner of my eye. The shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, almost as if something, or someone, was hiding just out of reach of the light. A cold chill ran through my body, my breath caught in my throat. I was no longer alone. And the fear that gripped me was no longer just from the eerie sounds or the bizarre temperature, it was something more primal. I started walking, faster now, my footsteps echoing in the narrow passage. The scraping sound continued, following me, getting closer with each step. I reached the end of the corridor and shoved against the rusted metal door, desperate to escape. But as my hand pressed against it, the door shuddered, as if resisting. I pushed harder. The door opened. But what I saw beyond it made my heart stop. On the other side, the room was unlike anything I had expected. It wasn't a simple storage area or maintenance space, as I had imagined. It was a vast, hollow chamber, bathed in an eerie glow that seemed to pulse from the walls themselves. The walls weren't made of concrete, they were covered in strange symbols, glowing faintly in the darkness, like something ancient, forgotten, and alive. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me. The cold, oppressive air enveloped me, and I could feel it, it was alive. The floor beneath me seemed to shift, as though the building itself was aware of my presence, and the walls seemed to close in. Then, I saw them. Figures. Shadows. Moving, always just out of the reach of the light. Their shapes were indistinct, but their presence was undeniable. I turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. I was trapped. And as the shadows drew closer, I realized that there was something worse than being alone in the dark, being watched by something that had been waiting for me to enter. Suddenly, the air seemed to crackle with a low hum, vibrating at a frequency that made my skin crawl. It was as if the building itself was awakening, and it didn't want me there. And then the floor cracked open beneath me. I fell into the darkness, screaming, as the world around me twisted, and something cold, ancient, and unforgiving reached out to claim me. As the story unfolded, I could feel the growing sense of dread intensifying with each passing moment. What had started as a simple inspection turned into a terrifying journey into the unknown. What was it that lurked in the forgotten corners of that building? And what did those strange figures want from me? What were they guarding? It's time for you to answer that question. Would you dare enter a place like that? Would you push forward, knowing that something was waiting for you, something that had been buried for far too long? Or would you turn back, leaving the mystery unsolved, the terror unspoken? The choice is yours. Felt a growing, undeniable sense that this was something far worse. Something not bound by the laws of nature, not explainable by any science I knew. This wasn't just a malfunction of the building or my senses. This was something alive. As I stood there, the echo of my own breath rising in the unnatural stillness, I realized I was no longer alone in the corridor. The air had thickened, and there was a presence behind me. I could feel it, an oppressive weight that seemed to push against my chest, pressing me into the concrete. The voice of the phantom engineers had quieted, but their presence was still there, all around me. I could almost hear their breath, feel their eyes watching me from the shadows just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Suddenly, the floor beneath me shifted. A deep, resonating thrum vibrated through the concrete as if the building itself was awakening, stretching and groaning with ancient purpose. My boots scraped against the cold floor as I instinctively took a step back. The wet footprints that had stopped advancing were now moving again, closer this time, impossibly close, as though the invisible entity was just inches behind me. I didn't dare turn around. Instead, I forced my feet to move, not running, not sprinting, but walking with slow, measured steps. The corridor stretched before me, impossibly long, the walls closing in tighter with each passing second. The emergency lights flickered erratically, casting momentary flashes of sickly green light, revealing the rusted door that had once blocked my exit. It was now wide open, a black void beyond. I took a breath, steeling myself, and then darted toward it, my body moving faster than it had ever moved before. But it wasn't the exit that I reached. It was just more corridor. More of that same endless passage. I stumbled and nearly fell, the cold air biting at my skin like claws, as I realized the horrifying truth: the building had shifted. The entire space had altered its dimensions. The walls had moved, and the passage was no longer a fixed reality. I turned back toward the open door. The sound of my heart beating in my ears drowned out everything else: the footsteps, the whispers, the vibration in the walls. But as I reached for the doorframe, I felt a tug, a strange, invisible force pulling me away. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire building. The vibration intensified to a near-deafening level, and a new voice joined the chorus of engineers, its tone darker, more menacing. "You're not meant to leave," it said, the words reverberating through the very bones of the building, as if they were being spoken by the walls themselves. "This place has been waiting for you." The light in the corridor flickered and dimmed. The temperature dropped even further, now so cold that my breath came in sharp, painful bursts. I could feel it in my bones. The building, whatever it was no longer simply an abandoned space. It was alive. A trap, a forgotten relic of something dark, pulling me into its depths. And I was its prey. I turned again, this time not running, but moving with purpose, my steps echoing louder and louder. The voice was behind me, whispering now, taunting me, each word feeding the darkness that seemed to close in tighter with every passing second. The corridor stretched endlessly, bending reality, mocking me as I struggled to hold on to the last shred of reason. I had to escape. I couldn't breathe. The walls were narrowing, the air growing thin, my pulse pounding in my ears. My flashlight flickered once more and then went out completely. In the suffocating dark, I could feel the invisible presence surrounding me, pressing in on all sides, waiting for me to make the final mistake. And then, just as my vision blurred and the world tilted, I heard something, a voice, this time not from the walls, but from behind me. "Welcome home." I spun around, but there was nothing. The corridor stretched on, the exit nowhere in sight. The building had become a labyrinth, and I had become its prisoner. What I had thought was a simple inspection had become something far more sinister. The very structure had been waiting for me, drawing me in, and now, there was no way out. But then, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of someone breathing down my neck. I didn't dare look back. I knew better. The coppery taste of fear coated my tongue as I turned to look back the way I had come. The wet footprints had multiplied. Dozens of sets now, each one distinct in size and shape, all leading toward me from a door that shouldn't exist, at the end of a corridor that couldn't exist. Panic surged in my chest. I pressed my back against the wall and closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, but it wasn't working. I could still hear the soft slapping sound of water against concrete, the echo of invisible steps closing in. My hands trembled violently as I pulled out my digital recorder. Desperation clung to me like a second skin. I had to document this, even if it was only to prove to myself later that I hadn't completely lost my mind. With a shaking finger, I pressed the record button, the only tether I had to some semblance of reality. I opened my eyes. The corridor had changed again. It wasn't just the footprints anymore. The walls, the floor, they were different. There were faded markings all over the concrete, scrawled in what looked like architectural annotations and construction notes. These weren't recent, they were carved into the very surface of the walls, as if etched by some unseen hand, the grooves packed with that same rust-red powder I had found on the door. I approached one section, my heart racing. I ran my fingers over the markings. It felt almost like the walls themselves were alive, responding to my touch. Some of the calculations were familiar: load distributions, tensile strength assessments, subsidence predictions, but others, the ones that caught my eye, were wrong. Deeply wrong. The kind of wrong that made your gut churn. Any structure built according to these specifications would collapse instantly, killing everyone inside. But then, as I looked closer, I saw something else: brilliant innovations, techniques that didn't belong. Things that shouldn't be possible with the technology of the 1970s, or even today. Construction methods I had never seen before, methods that could defy the laws of physics. The whispering in the air, the voice from the walls, changed then, becoming more direct, more urgent. Inspector Warren Mitchell, Structural Assessment of Kenton Industrial Complex, August 17, 2025. Subject terminated inspection at 4:47 p.m. after exposure to non-standard architectural anomalies. My blood turned to ice. That was my name. Today's date. The exact project I was working on. But I hadn't terminated anything. I wasn't even close to done. I checked my watch, 4:46 p.m. The second hand ticked forward. 4:47. At that exact moment, the emergency lights went dark. Complete darkness. The kind of darkness you can't escape, the kind that swallows you whole. I fumbled for my flashlight, but it was dead. Of course, it was dead. In the suffocating blackness, I felt something brush against my shoulder. Something solid yet insubstantial, like fingers composed of static electricity. A chill ran through my body. The air around me crackled, vibrating with energy, as if the very structure of the building was coming alive. The whispering in the dark grew louder, more frantic. Multiple voices, now. All speaking in that same cold technical language, construction jargon, engineering terminology, but twisted. It was wrong. The voices weren't just describing the building's structure. They were describing something worse. Something dark. They spoke of how the building had been constructed, not with concrete and steel, but with something else. How certain structures weren't designed for physical support, but to contain something. Something that existed between spaces. Between times. How the anomalous readings I had detected, the ones that made no sense, the ones that had nearly killed me, weren't malfunctions. They were measurements of something bleeding through from elsewhere. The walls, the building itself. It wasn't just a place. It was a prison. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered back to life. The beam illuminated something that hadn't been there before, a single sheet of blueprint paper, lying on the floor before me, its edges crinkled and yellowed. I hadn't dropped it. No one had. I bent down, shaking, and picked it up. It was the original construction plan for this building, dated 1977, the original plan. But it was different from the copies I had studied. This version showed the attic level in vivid detail, the very corridor I stood in. And in the margins were handwritten notes that made my skin crawl. Boundary unstable in this section. Temporal displacement observed during concrete pouring. 3 workers lost during final phase. Corridor sealed as containment measure. The implications hit me like a punch to the gut. The building hadn't been abandoned due to an economic downturn, as the developers had claimed. It had been abandoned deliberately. And now, the renovations were disturbing something that had been carefully contained. Something that had been waiting. The wet footprints around me began to dry, one by one, fading into the concrete as if they had never been. The vibration in the air slowly subsided, but the unease in my chest remained. The corridor, which had seemed endless moments before, now appeared as it originally had, short, straight, unremarkable. But something had changed. I looked down at the blueprint in my hands, only to find that it had transformed into my own inspection notes. The disturbing marginalia had disappeared, replaced by my mundane observations about ceiling height and beam placement. But it wasn't over. The air shifted again, the temperature dropping even further. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. The oppressive feeling returned, thicker than before, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. The whispers came again, softer this time, and they carried with them a promise. You've seen it now. There's no going back. The walls trembled as if they were reacting to the words, to my presence. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the world seemed to bend, warp, around me. The building wasn't just old and forgotten. It was alive, alive in ways I had never understood, alive in ways that no rational mind could comprehend. And as I stood in that cursed corridor, I realized the most terrifying truth of all: I hadn't just found a hidden section of the building. I had found the heart of it. And now, I was part of its story. I made my way back to the attic's exit, moving quickly but forcing myself not to run. Each step felt as though I were walking through molasses, my body lean with exhaustion and lingering fear. But no further manifestations occurred. No voices, no footprints, no impossible architecture. I kept my eyes focused ahead, trying to push the terrifying images of the last few hours from my mind. When I finally pushed through the access door and descended into the main building, everything seemed normal. Sunshine streamed through the tall industrial windows, casting warm beams across the empty floors. My phone regained signal immediately, showing 3 missed calls from the development company. They were wondering about my assessment, asking why I hadn't returned their calls. I should have told them the truth. That the attic level needed to remain sealed. That the renovation should be abandoned entirely. But I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something much worse than just structural instability. Instead, I reported structural issues that would make the conversion economically unfeasible, without mentioning what I had experienced. Numbers don't lie. Concrete doesn't deceive. My fabricated structural assessment would ensure the building remained empty, untouched. I told myself it was for the best, that the truth would only bring destruction, but deep down, I knew it was more than just the building I was trying to protect. Later that night, as I transcribed my actual experiences into a private journal, I noticed something strange about the digital recordings I had taken. Between my spoken notes, there were long stretches of static. But in those silent moments, faint voices spoke, a low hum of construction projects that never existed, and one chilling voice that spoke directly into the microphone when I was certain I had been alone. "It's always the engineers," it whispered, the words smooth and unnatural. "They think they understand how buildings work, how spaces connect, how structures contain. They never realize they're just creating more doors." My blood ran cold. The voice had been in the room with me. But how? My phone hadn't even been near me when I was in the attic. The next day, I resigned from the project. A week after that, I resigned from civil engineering altogether. The truth was undeniable now: some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. And some spaces, they were never meant to be inhabited. I still dream about that corridor. In my dreams, I walk through it, and it always expands before me, growing longer and longer. But now, I'm not just walking, I'm leaving wet footprints behind me as I move forward. The very thing I feared has become part of me. Story 2, The Restoration of the Past. The leather tore beneath my fingers like wet paper, and what I found inside was not the expected horsehair stuffing, but something much darker. A cavity exhaled a briny smell of ancient seawater, the scent pungent and thick, as though the chair had been submerged in the depths of the ocean for decades. The temperature in my workshop dropped suddenly, and I felt a chill spread across my skin. I stepped back instinctively, though the room itself seemed unchanged. The Victorian armchair had arrived just 3 days ago, its mahogany frame solid but its upholstery torn as if by great claws. As I peeled back another strip of the damaged leather, the chair trembled beneath my touch. It wasn't the gentle vibration of a loose joint or the creaking of an old piece of furniture, it was rhythmic. Distinct. Like something contained, something waiting. I'm Thomas Mercer, a furniture restoration specialist focused on 19th century pieces. I've spent 15 years restoring antiques, breathing life back into objects that were thought to be beyond repair. My workshop is located in the basement of a century-old building in Portsmouth, fitting, given the maritime history embedded in most of the pieces I work on. My reputation for discretion and skill brings me clients with unusual requests, but nothing could have prepared me for this. The delivery men had struggled with it despite its unremarkable size. They complained about unexpected weight shifts, as though the chair were redistributing itself in their grip. At the time, I dismissed their concerns as typical grumbling from overworked, underpaid workers. But when they left, I examined the chair under the harsh workshop lights, and I began to sense that something was wrong. A gentleman's fireside armchair, circa 1870, upholstered in cracked burgundy leather with brass studs along the rolled arms, distinguished, except for the violent damage to its seat and back. Parallel gashes that suggested something had fought to escape from within. The client, a Mr. Blackwood, had provided minimal information. According to his notes, the chair had been salvaged from a coastal manor slated for demolition. The property had belonged to a sea captain who disappeared in the 1890s. His instructions were equally sparse: repair the upholstery while preserving as much of the original material as possible. Routine work, I thought. But as I set to work that first night, measuring the damage and making material lists, I noticed something odd. The chair felt cold. Cold to the touch, cooler than the surrounding air, as if it resisted the warmth of the workshop. I traced my fingers over the tiers, following their violent arcs. The leather seemed to shudder, as though recoiling from my touch. The air was growing heavier, more oppressive, and I began to feel watched. A sensation I couldn't shake, a pressure from the chair itself, as though it were something more than just an antique object. Something had happened to this chair, something I couldn't understand. The deeper I delved into its history, the more its mystery seemed to deepen. That's when I felt it, like fingers pressing against the back of my neck, invisible but undeniable. The hairs stood up on end, and I turned quickly, but there was nothing in the room. Just the chair, standing there like an ominous sentinel in the dim light. But I knew then that I wasn't alone in this room. The chair seemed to groan in protest as I continued peeling back the layers of its upholstery. Something inside shifted. Something alive. My mind raced through all the possible explanations, nothing made sense. But as I reached deeper, I uncovered something that made me freeze. A hidden compartment, a secret place in the chair's structure. And inside it, was a small, weathered journal. The handwriting was cramped and desperate, filled with references to strange occurrences aboard the sea captain's ship, the HMS Nightingale, and how he had found something, on his travels, something that should never have been uncovered. The last entry, written in a shaky hand, read: "The chair. It waits for the next one. It will never let them leave." That was when I knew. The chair wasn't just furniture. It was cursed, and something far older and far more dangerous than I had ever imagined had been bound to it. The chair was a vessel for something far darker, something that was now awake, and it wanted out. As I stood there in my workshop, the lights flickered, and I swore I saw movement in the corner of my eye. The chair trembled, vibrating again, this time, more violently. The next morning, I decided it was time to stop. The chair was no longer a simple restoration project. It was an object that carried a terrible weight with it, something that had crossed time, that had seen and carried things it was never meant to. I took the chair outside, planning to burn it. But when I returned, it was gone. The workshop was empty, and the door was still locked. There was no sign of it, just a faint, briny smell hanging in the air. Now, every night, I hear it. The whispering voice of the sea captain. And in my dreams, I see the chair, waiting, empty, but with something stirring beneath its surface, waiting for its next victim. And I know, deep down, that I will never be free of it. Some objects, once touched, never let go. The deepest gash revealed a glimpse of something wrong. Beneath the Victorian leather upholstery, something far from belonging in 19th century furniture, a waterlogged document, its ink barely legible. I extracted it carefully, feeling a chill run through me as I held the fragile paper in my hands. It was a ship's manifest, dated 1889. Captain Everett's final voyage manifest listed standard cargo, but it was the handwritten note in the margin that caught my attention. It simply read, "Salvage operation successful." My heart skipped a beat. The note didn't belong. I set the paper aside to dry, planning a more thorough examination later, but something tugged at my mind. My work wasn't finished with the chair yet. As I returned to examine it further, my thumb caught on something sharp protruding from the stuffing. I pulled it free, a fragment of something hard, iridescent, curved like a claw or scale. The strange material shimmered under my work light. It possessed the pearlescent quality of shell but felt heavier than it should have. As I turned the fragment in my hand, it seemed to pulse with an inner luminescence. For a brief moment, I could have sworn it shifted color, casting off faint, rippling waves of light. My pulse quickened. There was something undeniably wrong with this object, something ancient and unnatural about it. I placed the shard in a specimen jar, noting its odd weight, its disturbing beauty, and how it seemed to resist being analyzed. That night, I locked up as usual, but sleep proved elusive. The storm outside provided an eerie soundtrack, the rain slashing against the windows, the wind howling through the cracks in the building's ancient walls. As I lay in bed, restless, my dreams became filled with dark water and distant scraping sounds, sounds that seemed to come from beneath the sea. I awoke abruptly at 3 a.m., my mind jolted by the unmistakable sound of movement from the workshop below. My heart hammered in my chest as I grabbed my flashlight, terrified to move. I descended the stairs, the beam of light quivering as I scanned the room. Everything appeared undisturbed. Except for the chair. It had moved. The one solid piece of furniture now lay approximately 6 inches from its previous position. It had shifted on its own, without sound, without explanation. I told myself I had simply forgotten its exact placement and returned to bed. But sleep remained a stranger, my mind racing with the implications of what I had just seen. The following morning, coffee in hand, I returned to the document I had found. The manifest was odd enough, but it was what came after that sent a chill through my spine. Beyond the cargo listing, a journal entry described a salvage operation off the New England coast, one that wasn't like anything Captain Everett had encountered before. The captain described a shipwreck, but not of wood and canvas, not of traditional materials. Instead, it was something organic, shell-like. The journal entry went on to describe how his crew had retrieved artifacts from the wreck that defied classification, components that seemed alive, that moved even when untouched by human hands. The final entry became increasingly erratic, the handwriting shaking and blurring as if the captain were writing through a haze of fear. He spoke of strange illnesses among the crew, of sounds emanating from the specimens, sounds that no human throat could produce. I should have stopped reading right there. I should have contacted the client and refused the project. Any rational person would have, but instead, I felt an inexplicable pull to continue, a professional fascination with the mystery laid before me. A part of me dismissed it, telling myself it was nothing more than the delusions of a sea captain, a hoax, or perhaps a warped memory. But a deeper part of me feared the truth. That afternoon, I began the preliminary repairs on the chair, carefully removing the damaged leather to access the frame beneath. The chair's stuffing revealed even more disturbing anomalies. Sections of conventional horsehair interspersed with fibrous material resembling sea kelp. It was preserved, yet still moist to the touch. And beneath this layer, I found something far more troubling, a latticework of something that looked like cartilage, not wood or metal, but cartilage, something organic, forming a secondary framework within the chair's otherwise conventional structure. The pattern reminded me of rib cages, or perhaps the interior of certain shellfish, but scaled to human proportions. Each discovery unearthed more questions, and yet, a part of me wanted to stop, to walk away and never look at this chair again. My work, which had always been meditative and calm, now filled me with unease. The workshop, usually comforting with its smells of wood polish and hide glue, now reeked of brine. The odor seemed to come from the chair itself, growing more intense with each passing hour. The building's usual creaks and the sounds of settling would seem to synchronize with my every movement, as if something was mimicking me, echoing my actions from within the walls. As night fell, I noticed something even stranger, a fine dust surrounding the chair on the floor. At first, I thought it was sawdust or perhaps leather shavings from my work, but upon closer inspection, I realized it wasn't any of those. It was something else, something resembling sand or crushed shell. I swept the particles into a pile, then examined them under my magnifying glass. To my horror, they moved. Microscopic movements. They reformed when left undisturbed, as though they were alive, shifting in the darkness. I sealed a sample in a jar, placing it beside the shell fragment I had found earlier. The pieces were beginning to fit together in a way that made no sense. But deep down, I knew they were connected, this chair, its origins, its mysterious past. That night, I stayed late, determined to make progress on the restoration. The storm outside intensified, with rain lashing the windows and wind howling through the building's ancient ventilation system. Around midnight, the power flickered and then went out completely, leaving me in darkness, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning. I fumbled for my emergency lantern, the light flickering weakly as it filled the room with a sickly glow. As I moved closer to the chair, I swore I saw its surface ripple, like a slow, undulating movement beneath the leather. The subtle motions weren't just caused by the storm outside, I realized, they were coming from within the chair itself. It was as though the chair was alive. I approached cautiously, the lantern extended in front of me. The leather continued to undulate, each wave of motion reminding me of muscles twitching beneath the skin. I leaned in closer, drawn in by the bizarre, hypnotic movement. And then, it happened. The chair emitted a sound. A low, rumbling groan. Not from the wood or the joints. It came from deep inside the chair, a noise like the creaking of ancient bones. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly backed away, my breath shallow. What had I uncovered? What had I brought into my workshop? As the night deepened, the chair stood there, quiet, its surface still rippling, its weighting palpable. I wasn't sure if it was the chair or the sea captain's curse that had found me, but one thing was certain, the chair was no longer a piece of furniture. It was a vessel. And it was waiting for something, or someone. The sound wasn't the usual creaking of settling wood, it was far more disturbing. It was disturbingly similar to the rhythmic rise and fall of respiratory effort. The leather expanded and contracted with a pattern that mimicked human breathing. My breath caught in my throat, my heart hammering in my chest as I instinctively took a step back, my body gripped by a paralyzing fear. The rational part of my mind scrambled desperately for explanations. Air pressure changes from the storm. Residual flexibility in the antique leather. Exhaustion playing tricks on me. But none of it seemed to fit. As the lantern's batteries flickered and weakened, casting more shadows than light, I decided it was time to leave. Grabbing my coat, I turned to walk toward the door, but then I glanced back, just for a second, and that's when I saw it. The chair had moved. It wasn't a dramatic shift, just a subtle movement, but it was enough to send a chill crawling down my spine. The chair had repositioned itself silently between me and the exit. The distance wasn't great, maybe only 3 feet from where it had been, but I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even come close. On the concrete floor, barely visible in the dimming light, spiral patterns trailed from the chair's feet. They were fine, continuous lines, like those a snail leaves on garden stones, only these were made of something darker. Something unnatural. My hands trembled as I edged around the chair, trying to maintain a distance, almost as if I were approaching a wild animal. The leather seemed to follow me, tracking my every movement. The tears in its surface, which had been previously small and contained, began to widen slightly as I passed by. The air grew heavier, thick with a sense of impending danger. Outside, I sat in my car, trying to calm my frantically beating heart. The rain drummed heavily on the roof, providing a rhythm that helped me focus. I told myself it was nothing, coincidence, fatigue. My mind was just playing tricks on me. Sleep came fitfully that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I was drowning in dark water, seeing massive shapes moving beneath the waves. I awoke repeatedly, each time certain that something was scraping at my bedroom door, dragging something sharp across the wood. The sounds were too real, too close. But when I opened the door, there was nothing. The morning light brought little relief. Though nothing seemed out of place, my apartment felt different. It was as if the space itself had been catalogued in my absence, examined and recorded, like something, someone, had been studying me. I considered contacting Mr. Blackwood, the client, to decline the project, to walk away from the chair, but curiosity gnawed at me. The mystery was too great. I had to know more. So, instead, I visited the university library, researching shipwrecks off the New England coast, circa 1889. There, I found references to the Vilmena, a research vessel that had mysteriously disappeared. Its wreckage was never recovered. Even more disturbing were documents detailing a quarantine at Blackwater Harbor that same year, a small port town that was erased from existence after authorities blockaded it, following reports of an unknown contagion. In the library's maritime archives, I found a single photograph of the harbor during the quarantine. Military personnel could be seen in the image, though blurred and indistinct, examining something pulled from the sea in fishing nets. The shape of whatever they were studying was distinctly non-human, with proportions that were entirely unnatural. The library also held a journal from a lighthouse keeper stationed near Blackwater. His entries were increasingly frantic, describing living holes crawling from the waves at night, and shells that moved independently of their occupants. The journal described creatures combining crustacean and cephalopod characteristics, growing to impossible sizes. The final pages spoke of infiltration and mimicry, with the creatures allegedly able to adopt aspects of their surroundings or hosts. The journal ended abruptly, 3 days before the quarantine began. I returned to my workshop, my stomach in knots, my mind racing. The chair awaited me, seemingly unchanged, though I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that it had somehow oriented itself toward the door, as if it had been expecting my return. The leather appeared drier now, tighter across the frame, with new cracks forming patterns reminiscent of the sketches in the lighthouse keeper's journal. The briny smell had intensified, mingling with something else, something musky, like the scent of predators at the zoo. Despite the unease gnawing at me, I decided to push forward with my documentation. I photographed the chair from multiple angles, hoping to capture the full extent of the damage. But when I later reviewed the images on my computer, I found something disturbing. There were discrepancies, subtle shifts in the chair's position between photos taken seconds apart. The patterns of the tiers weren't consistent, the texture visible through the gashes was different. In one of the images, something was visible in the deepest tier, something reflective, like a compound eye, partially concealed by the leather. I stared at the image for what felt like an eternity. The eye in the tier wasn't human. It was alien, unnatural, and I could feel it staring back at me, its unblinking gaze making my skin crawl. That night, as I worked late into the evening, determined to complete the documentation phase, I discovered something new. Hidden deeper within the chair's structure, in a compartment I had not previously noticed, was another document. This time, it was not a ship's manifest, but something far worse, something that connected the chair to the dark history I had only begun to uncover. I didn't want to open it. But I knew I had to. I had to know what had been sealed inside. The letter was written in Captain Everett's hand, addressed to a Professor Harrove at Miskatonic University. My fingers trembled as I read the captain's words, his description of something neither plant nor animal, yet possessing characteristics of both. He had encountered this creature after tracking bioluminescent phenomena off the coast, a discovery that had led him to capture the specimen. He reported that the creature was dormant when retrieved, but it had reactivated during transport, prompting the need for containment within a constructed organic matrix to prevent its escape. The urgency in the captain's handwriting was palpable. He requested specialized equipment to contain the creature, claiming that conventional tools passed harmlessly through its tissues without leaving any lasting effect. The implications of this letter hit me like a cold wave. I could no longer deny it. The chair, the object I had so meticulously restored, was more than just a relic of the past. It was a vessel, a containment vessel, holding something that was very much alive. The letter ended with the captain's plea for assistance, a desperate request for a safe method of handling the specimen. He feared that without it, the creature would escape, and whatever it was, whatever it had become, could cause untold damage. My mind raced as I re-examined my restoration tools with a new, growing unease. The chair had begun making noises while the workshop was otherwise silent, not creaking or shifting as old furniture often does, but producing a wet, organic sound, like thick liquid moving through valves. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The chair was not merely a piece of furniture, it was alive, and it was reacting to me. When I approached the chair with my leather knife, the noises stopped, as if the chair had recognized my intentions. The surface tension in the upholstery increased visibly, like skin stretching over a swelling mass. A part of me, still clinging to my professional pride, insisted on continuing the project. I told myself this was just a peculiarity, a strange but explainable anomaly. But as each day passed, I couldn't deny the mounting evidence. Whatever resided within the chair was still in some capacity alive. I made a decision, self-preservation mixed with a professional compromise. I would repair the external damage while avoiding any deeper intervention in the chair's structure. No more probing, no more tampering. I began limiting my work to daylight hours, keeping my sharp tools within easy reach, just in case. The chair's behavior escalated. No longer did it only reposition itself at night, it began to move during the day, subtly shifting as I worked, as if testing the limits of my awareness. The leather beneath my hands would sometimes yield, soft and yielding, like flesh rather than hide, pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. And more than once, I glimpsed something within the tiers, something iridescent and jointed, retracting quickly into the shadowed recesses of the chair. The spiral patterns on the floor around the chair expanded daily. What had started as faint lines now spread across the concrete, growing more intricate, more deliberate. Each morning, new sections would appear, and each new pattern seemed to draw closer to my tools, to my material storage, and even to the stairs that led up to my apartment. It felt as if the chair was mapping my workspace, tracking my movements, learning my patterns. The spirals were no longer random, they were intentional. I began photographing these patterns, noting their resemblance to the mathematical sequences found in certain marine organisms, the same structures found in deep-sea creatures whose patterns governed their movement and behavior. The chair wasn't just a passive object in the room anymore. It was active. Alive. Last night marked the culmination of my experience with the chair. I had completed the external repairs, replacing the damaged leather with materials that were true to the period, all while carefully avoiding further probing into the chair's deeper structure. But as I applied the final coat of leather conditioner, something unexpected happened. My hand brushed against something that hadn't been there before, a small, shell-like protrusion emerging from the seam along the chair's arm. I barely had time to register the object before it retracted, pulling back into the leather with a speed that made my heart race. The chair shuddered beneath my touch, as if it were alive, breathing, aware of my every movement. The leather began to undulate rhythmically, as if something deep within the chair was stirring. The newly repaired sections, those that I had worked so hard to restore, began to bulge outward, stretching the stitches I had so carefully placed. And then the sounds came. No furniture should make these kinds of sounds. They were clicks and burbles, sounds reminiscent of tide pools at night, alive with movement. The spiral patterns on the floor intensified, extending visibly across the concrete as if invisible appendages were carving them into the ground. And then, the chair's most terrifying feature revealed itself. The largest tear, the one I had so meticulously stitched, began to split open again. Not randomly, no, the tear opened with precision, like a surgeon making an incision. Something inside was pushing out, forcing its way free. Within the widening gap, something glistened, something with the iridescence of abalone shell, but structured like interlocking plates of armor. A protrusion emerged from the tear, jointed and articulated like a crab's limb, but with an unsettling flexibility, as if it had been designed to move in ways that defied the typical laws of nature. The limb extended toward my workbench, toward the specimen jar containing the fragment I had removed earlier. That was the moment I broke. Self-preservation, finally, overcame my curiosity. I backed away from the chair, my heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I reached for the door, my feet moving as if they were carrying me in slow motion, but the chair moved too. It didn't crawl. It didn't shift across the floor. It scuttled. In an instant it was between me and the door, its mahogany frame creaking as the leather bulged from multiple points. Something inside was redistributing its mass. The chair was no longer a piece of furniture. It was something else, something ancient, something waiting. And it was coming for me. I stumbled back, my breath ragged, my pulse racing. The chair was no longer an object. It was alive, and it was aware of me. The storm outside howled against the windows, the wind screaming as the chair, its leather surface now taut and twisted, seemed to breathe. I realized, with growing horror, that I had opened the door. But now, I couldn't close it again. Some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed. And this one, this cursed chair, was one of them. The smell of seawater became overwhelming. It wasn't the clean, briny scent of the open ocean. No, this was the rotting brine of deep ocean trenches, places where sunlight never reaches, where life struggles against the crushing weight of the abyss. The stench permeated the room, seeping into my very pores as panic gripped me. In desperation, I grabbed a restoration solvent from my shelf, highly corrosive to organic materials, and flung it at the chair. The effect was immediate. Terrible. The leather sizzled on contact, and from within came a sound that no human vocal apparatus could produce. It was high-pitched, oscillating, a shriek that vibrated the glass jars on my shelves, rattling them with unnatural intensity. The chair convulsed. Its wooden frame splintered, the sound of cracking joints filling the room as something beneath the upholstery thrashed in apparent agony. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins. I didn't hesitate. Taking advantage of the distraction, I bolted for the door, panic flooding my every nerve. I glanced back just once before escaping into the hallway. What I saw made my blood run cold. The chair's form was collapsing inward. Its structure was dissolving into something less recognizable as furniture and more resembling a partial exoskeleton. Through the widening gaps in its surface, I saw movement. Segmented appendages, gleaming with the iridescence of shell, withdrew deeper into the chair's interior. The solvent was working, slowly, but the chair was alive, and whatever had been trapped within it was desperate to escape. I didn't stick around to see what would happen next. I ran. I spent the night in a hotel, far from the workshop, but the terror never left me. I returned to the workshop the next day, bringing with me a colleague, someone who could provide a rational perspective. A furniture conservator, skeptical of anything beyond the conventional. 31:26, when we arrived, the workshop seemed undisturbed, save for one detail, the chair. It had returned to its apparent normalcy. The damage from the solvent was visible, but not catastrophic. All signs of movement, of organic components, were gone. But the spiral patterns on the floor remained, unmoved, undisturbed. They had extended further, radiating outward to every corner of the room, and in places, they stretched up the walls, forming an intricate map of my workspace. My colleague found nothing to support my wild account. He suggested that I had likely suffered from isolation and work stress, perhaps experiencing parasomnia or hallucinations. The chair, according to his examination, was nothing more than an unusual Victorian piece with evidence of amateur repair attempts and water damage consistent with salvage from a coastal property. I was left with a sense of creeping unease, but no evidence that could prove my suspicions. So, I moved the chair into a storage unit, trying to distance myself from it, from the madness it had dragged me into. But Mr. Blackwood, my client, remained unreachable. His contact information was invalid. Further research into his identity revealed troubling connections to fringe marine biology organizations, groups known for their questionable practices and dangerous, unregulated experiments. The documents I recovered from the chair are now sealed in waterproof containers, locked away from the world. But their contents raise more questions than answers. What had Captain Everett truly retrieved from the depths? And why had he sealed it away? Why had he gone to such lengths to contain it, to hide it? Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake to the sound of something scratching at my apartment door. It's not the desperate clawing of a trapped creature. No, it's the methodical, patient scraping of something mapping its surroundings, learning and adapting. I've begun to find spiral patterns in unexpected places, on the condensation of my bathroom mirror, on the frost patterns on my windows, even in the arrangement of my belongings when I return home. Subtly, silently, everything is being reorganized, as if an invisible force is drawing everything into a larger pattern, a plan. Yesterday, I received a package containing a commission request for additional restoration work on related items from the Everett collection, a writing desk, a wardrobe, and a 4-poster bed frame. All reportedly salvaged from the same coastal property. The letterhead on the commission paper shows a spiral pattern identical to those carved into the floor of my workshop. I haven't decided yet whether to accept the commission. Something tells me I shouldn't. Story 3, The Silent Hanger. The spotlight cut through the darkness like a knife, its beam catching dust particles that danced in the air. The light moved without reason, without a guiding hand. It shouldn't have been working, there was no power in the hanger. The spotlight pivoted on its mount, rotating with eerie precision. No cables, no sound, no rational explanation for how it moved. I stood frozen in the center of Hangar 14, my camera hanging limp from my neck, it strapped like a noose. The massive WWT searchlight moved again, as though it were alive, and I felt a cold dread settle over me. The metal beneath my boots seemed to vibrate at a frequency just below hearing, a deep hum that wasn't quite sound, more a feeling, like the phantom rumble of engines that had been silent for decades. I've always been drawn to abandoned places, to the beauty of forgotten history. As a photographer specializing in military aircraft, I've spent countless nights exploring decommissioned bases and abandoned airfields across the country. But Miller Air Base was different. The moment I stepped through the rusted doors of Hangar 14, something had felt wrong. A coldness that penetrated deeper than skin. A silence that wasn't empty but alive, as though the building itself was holding its breath. The air was thick, oppressive, almost as if the hangar was alive, aware of my presence. The airfield's caretaker had warned me about this place, his voice heavy with a strange detachment. When I'd asked about access to the hangars for my photography project on B7 maintenance facilities, his face twitched almost imperceptibly. He hadn't wanted to speak of it, but there was something urgent in his hesitation. "You don't want to be here at night," he had said, his voice low, as though sharing a secret. "Something's wrong with Hangar 14. Stay away from it." I had ignored his warning, thinking it was nothing more than an old man's superstitions. But now, as the spotlight moved and the vibrations intensified, I began to wonder if there was more truth to his words than I had ever imagined. What was in this hangar? What was lurking, waiting for me to uncover? And most terrifying of all, why was I so compelled to keep digging, to keep photographing, to keep unraveling the mysteries of places like this? Because something was waiting, and it was not willing to stay buried. He'd eventually agreed, handing me a ring of massive keys with a warning that no one ever requested to visit Hangar 14, especially after dark. I had dismissed it then, thinking it was just the ramblings of a lonely old man who had spent too many years listening to the wind howl through empty buildings. Now, standing frozen in the center of Hangar 14, as the searchlight swung around again, I wasn't so sure. The light cut through the dark, catching the concrete floor in its sweep, revealing a series of overlapping circular marks. These weren't the linear skid marks I'd expect from landed aircraft. No, they were perfect circles, like something had descended straight down from the sky. I pulled out my research materials, flipping through the declassified layouts of the facility, but found no record of vertical landing capabilities here, nothing that would explain these strange marks. My heart rate quickened, a subtle pulse of panic surging through me as I photographed the patterns. The mechanical click of my vintage camera was unnaturally loud in the cavernous space, echoing around me as if it was the only sound in the world. The spotlight completed its rotation and passed over me again, and that's when something impossible happened. The air above my head compressed and displaced. It pushed down with enough force to make my knees buckle slightly. My ears popped from the sudden pressure change, and instinctively, I ducked, as though something massive had just passed overhead, something I couldn't see but could feel in the very fabric of the air around me. Sweat broke out across my forehead despite the chill of November. I backed away, my boots scuffing against the concrete as I moved toward the wall, toward the relative safety of a boundary I could understand. The spotlight continued its slow, mechanical rotation, sweeping across the empty hangar where World War II bombers had once been maintained and repaired. My hand fumbled for my flashlight, but the beam was weak compared to the power of the searchlight. The spotlight paused for a brief moment on a section of the floor about 20 feet away from me. That's when I noticed something peculiar. The dust in that area was disturbed, not in the way you'd expect from footprints. These marks weren't solid impressions. They were lighter, as if the very concept of a footprint had been suggested rather than imprinted. My rational mind fought to maintain control. It was just dust patterns formed by air currents, I told myself. Old buildings had strange acoustics. The pressure changes were probably due to broken ventilation systems coming to life in forgotten corners of the vast structure. The circular marks must have been from equipment long removed, their purpose lost in redacted files. Yet, none of these explanations accounted for one thing: the spotlight was working. There was no power to the hangar. The facility had been silent for decades, and yet the spotlight moved as if it were fully functional. I approached the light itself, careful not to step directly into the beam. The massive apparatus stood on its original mount, a relic from when the facility had been a bustling hub of America's war effort. I examined it closely, but there were no cables, no batteries, no modifications of any kind. It should have been as dead and silent as the rest of the hangar. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I placed my hand on the cool metal housing of the light. The instant my skin made contact, the rotation stopped abruptly. The beam froze in place, casting its harsh light on a far corner of the hangar. My breath caught in my throat as I looked into that corner, and there, in the darkness, I saw something. A shadow, an unmistakable human silhouette, against the wall. It was there for an instant, then vanished the moment I blinked. My heart hammered against my ribs. I called out, my voice echoing in the emptiness, distorted and somehow wrong, as if the acoustics of the building itself were twisting my words. "Is anyone there?" I shouted, but there was no answer. And yet, the sensation of being watched intensified. I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on me, dozens of them, from every direction. Determined to document everything, I began photographing the hangar systematically, my camera clicking away. Each time the spotlight passed over me, having resumed its slow rotation the moment I removed my hand, the same displacement of air occurred. The force grew stronger with each pass, until by the fifth rotation, it was powerful enough to ruffle my hair and tug at my clothing, like the downwash from rotors passing just overhead. Time seemed to stretch and contract within the hangar. What felt like minutes on my watch turned into hours. The shadows deepened, and the coldness in the air seemed to grow heavier, almost alive, as if the very building was watching me. My mouth went dry, my hands trembled slightly as I changed photographic plates. I had come prepared with traditional equipment, not digital, but my preparations felt meaningless in the face of what I was experiencing. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was documenting something wrong. Something far beyond what I had ever imagined. Miller Air Base had been abandoned for decades, and yet something alive still haunted Hangar 14. As the spotlight continued to move and the air grew thicker, I realized I was no longer alone. The building, long forgotten by those who once inhabited it, had remembered me. I wasn't just a visitor. I was part of its long history, and now, I was trapped within its walls, forced to witness things I was never meant to understand. And as the shadows moved and the pressure continued to build, I couldn't help but wonder what had once occupied this hangar, and why the airfield's caretaker had warned me so cryptically about the place. The truth was out there, and the spotlight was revealing it, piece by piece. But I wasn't sure I was ready to face what came next. There was something about capturing these historical spaces with the same technology that would have documented them in their prime. It felt authentic, like I was connecting with the past through the lens of a medium that had been present during those pivotal moments in history. But when I developed the photographic plates later, I would discover the true horror of Hangar 14. At some point during my time in the hangar, I noticed that the spotlight's movements had changed. No longer did it perform its usual full rotation. Instead, it began to focus on specific areas of the hangar, lingering on them for extended periods, as if searching or showing me something hidden. The beam finally settled on one section of the floor, where particularly dense circular markings covered the concrete. As it held on that spot, the air above it began to shimmer, undulating like heat rising off summer asphalt. Despite the hangar's bone-chilling cold, the temperature seemed to shift. I raised my camera with trembling hands, each exposure clicking sharply in the silence. The displacement in the air had become continuous now, a persistent downward pressure that made my ears hurt. It was as though the atmosphere itself was pressing down on me. The air felt heavy, thick, forcing me to widen my stance just to keep my balance. Then the sound came. But not through my ears, it came through my bones, reverberating in my teeth and chest. A deep, pulsing thrum that I recognized from hundreds of hours of research recordings. It was the unmistakable engine signature of AB-7 Flying Fortress. But wrong. Distorted, as though it were playing at the wrong speed. Slower. It made my skin crawl, this deep, mechanical hum that seemed to come from everywhere. I backed away, my shoulder blades pressing against the cold metal wall of the hangar. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming now. The spotlight swung toward me with sudden, deliberate movement, its harsh glare pinning me in place. My eyes watered from the unexpected intensity, and my skin prickled with heat. Through squinted eyes, I noticed something even worse. Dark shapes began to form in the spotlight itself. Silhouettes of men standing in formation. Their features were indistinct, blurry, but the outlines of oxygen masks covering the lower portions of their faces were unmistakable. My rational mind shattered. None of this was possible. None of this made sense. The caretaker had mentioned something about Hangar 14 being part of a classified testing program in the later years of the war, experiments with new navigation systems designed to allow bombing runs in zero-visibility conditions. He had mumbled something about accidents and the facility being suddenly decommissioned, with the records sealed and forgotten. But none of it explained what I was seeing now. The spotlight pivoted away abruptly, releasing me from its hold, and I gasped for breath, realizing I hadn't been breathing for a few moments. My legs wobbled, threatening to give way beneath me. Pins and needles shot up and down my calves, as though I had been standing still for hours instead of mere minutes. The spotlight resumed its rotation, but now it moved with purpose. It illuminated sections of the hangar in a specific sequence, pausing on each area just long enough for me to feel the presence of something substantial forming in the air above it. Swallowing my fear, I forced myself to follow the beam's guidance. I took photographs at each location the spotlight illuminated, my camera feeling impossibly heavy in my hands. Each click of the shutter seemed to agitate whatever presence filled the hangar, making the air around me grow thicker, the pressure building. The air displacements became more violent, and the engine noise, a deep, throbbing hum, rose in pitch, until it bordered on painful. Hours seemed to pass in this macabre dance between myself, the spotlight, and whatever invisible presence was being revealed by the light. Outside, the storm had intensified. The wind howled, and the rain lashed against the hangar walls, though there were no windows to confirm the storm's fury. My watch had stopped at 3:17 a.m., another impossibility to add to the growing list. Time itself seemed to warp and stretch within the hangar. What should have been minutes felt like hours. My sense of reality was slipping away, and I was no longer sure if I was losing my mind or witnessing something unexplainable. The final revelation came when the spotlight suddenly powered down, plunging the hangar into total darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, panic rising in my throat like bile, but before I could find it, the spotlight blazed back to life, twice as bright as before, now projecting directly upward to the ceiling of the hangar. What I saw there shattered my understanding of reality. The ceiling was no longer just a metal structure. Instead, it reflected an aerial view of London during the Blitz. The city was ablaze, fires burning across the skyline, searchlights scanning the sky, and the unmistakable silhouette of AB-7 Flying Fortress flying far too low. But it wasn't just an aerial view. No. The perspective was from above the bomber, as if I were witnessing its approach from an impossible vantage point. The sight was wrong, impossibly wrong. The hangar, the place where I stood, no longer felt like the present. It was as though the building had transcended time itself, showing me a moment from the past, a moment when death reigned from the sky. The B-7 was descending, the engine noise filling the hangar as though it were about to crash into me, and the air felt dense, heavy with the weight of history and something far more sinister. I stepped back, my mind unraveling as the spotlight focused directly on me again, locking me into its gaze. I felt the air tighten around me, suffocating me. And for a brief, heart-stopping moment, I understood what had happened here. This wasn't just a hangar. It was a rift. A portal between times, and between worlds. The real horror was not what I had seen, but what I was seeing. And the longer I stayed in Hangar 14, the more I realized that there was no leaving. There was no escape from this place, because it was never meant to be left. My legs finally gave way, and I collapsed to my knees, my camera still clutched protectively against my chest. The air pressure in the hangar dropped catastrophically, an unnatural force pressing down on me. My eardrums felt as though they were about to rupture. The concrete beneath me trembled, and dust rained down from support beams that had stood motionless for decades. The very foundation of the building seemed to groan in protest, as if it were alive, reacting to whatever was unfolding. And then, everything stopped. The spotlight flickered and switched off, this time for good. The overwhelming light that had filled the hangar with otherworldly intensity was gone, leaving only the silence that had once defined the abandoned space. My flashlight, now working again, was a dim and pathetic substitute for the powerful beam that had revealed so much. The hangar was just a hangar again, empty, cold, and abandoned. My heart pounded in my chest as I gathered my equipment with shaking hands, desperate to flee from the place that had held me captive for what felt like an eternity. 3 days later, I developed the photographic plates in my dark room, hoping for some semblance of normalcy after the terrifying events. What the plates revealed, however, has haunted me ever since. Each image showed the same empty hangar, but in the areas where the spotlight had lingered the longest, there was something else, silhouettes of airmen. Some stood at attention, others seated as if at control stations, all wearing the distinctive oxygen masks of high-altitude bomber crews. Their forms were transparent, yet unmistakable. The positioning of their figures corresponded exactly to the crew stations of AB-7 Flying Fortress. But the most disturbing discovery came when I developed the final plate, the one I had taken when the spotlight had projected upward. The image didn't show the ceiling of the hangar. Instead, it showed the interior of a bomber cockpit, viewed from the navigator's position. Through the windows, I could see fires burning across London. The reflection of the pilot's face was visible in the glass. His oxygen mask was pulled halfway off, and his expression was frozen in a moment of terrible realization. The nightmare was not just in the hangar, but in the air itself, in the time it had captured. The truth began to settle in, a cold weight pressing on my chest. The hangar had been a portal, not just to the past, but to a past that had never truly left. These airmen were trapped in an endless loop, replaying their final moments. I had witnessed a ghostly imprint in time, a place where reality had been torn apart. Since that night, I've spent months researching the classified records of Miller Air Base. What I found suggests that, in the final months of the war, experimental technology was being tested. Attempts were made to create a navigation system that could somehow remember previous flight paths and replay them with perfect accuracy. The project, however, was abandoned after a test flight never returned. The bomber and its crew vanished during what was supposed to be a simulated bombing run. The air base was decommissioned shortly afterward, and Hangar 14 was sealed. The records were buried, forgotten. But I had uncovered them, and in doing so, I had opened a door to something that should have remained closed. I don't photograph abandoned airfields anymore. I can't. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel that displacement of air above me, the weight of something massive passing overhead, trapped in an endless replay of its final moments. And in my dreams, I see those circular markings on the hangar floor. Not as landing patterns, but as ripples in reality itself. Points where something had punctured the thin membrane between then and now, between there and here. Points where something is still trying to return home. Story 4, The Chains of St. Augustine's. The first time I heard the chains move, I convinced myself it was the wind. The second time, I blamed the settling of the old building. But by the third time, when I saw the rusted link sway in perfect unison with no air moving, I could no longer deny what my eyes were witnessing. Something was walking among the shadows of St. Augustine's quarantine hospice, and it was making its presence known. My name is Dr. Marcus Thorne, a maritime historian specializing in quarantine practices of the 19th century Atlantic Passage. When the Historical Maritime Preservation Society offered me the opportunity to catalog artifacts at St. Augustine's, an abandoned quarantine hospice on Fever Island, I jumped at the chance. The hospice had been sealed since 1897, when the practice of isolating potentially infected travelers fell out of favor. According to the Society's records, many of the original furnishings and medical implements remained intact, untouched for over a century. But what the Society failed to mention was the tide's peculiar behavior around the island. The brochure had described a tidal anomaly that temporarily isolated the hospice each evening, but downplayed its severity. I discovered the truth shortly after my arrival. By 4 p.m., the surrounding lands flooded completely, transforming the hospice into an island within an island, cut off from the rest of the world until the following morning. The locals who transported me by boat seemed anxious to leave, pointing to their watches repeatedly, as if warning me of some unspoken deadline. Their unease didn't fully settle in until later that evening, as the water continued to rise, submerging the landscape around me. The hospice, isolated and alone, became a prison of its own design. And by the time night fell, the shadows had grown long, stretching across the walls as though they were moving with a life of their own. The chains in the dark moved again. This time, I was certain they weren't the product of wind or the building's natural decay. I had to find out what lay beneath the surface of this forgotten place. I had to know what it was that walked among us, bound by chains, waiting to tell its story. The hospice loomed against the gray October sky, a monument to forgotten suffering. 3 stories of weathered stone and rotting timber, its windows like hollow eyes staring out toward the sea. Inside, the main floor housed the receiving area, quarantine offices, and staff quarters. The second and third floors contained the isolation rooms where those suspected of carrying diseases like typhoid, cholera, or yellow fever awaited their fate. But it was the chains that most struck me, hundreds of them, hanging from reinforced ceiling mounts throughout the building. From my research, I knew they had once been used to suspend travelers' luggage above the floor, where it could be fumigated with burning sulfur or chlorine. This practice reflected the miasma theory that had been popular at the time, the belief that disease spread through poisonous air rather than germs. Keeping potentially contaminated objects elevated was thought to minimize the spread. I spent my first day documenting the ground floor, photographing ledgers showing passenger names and their ultimate fates, released, transferred to hospital, or simply deceased. As the daylight began to fade, I set up my temporary workspace in what had once been the head physician's office. It was the room farthest from the chains that filled the main hall, and I thought it would offer a bit of safety from the strange atmosphere that seemed to pervade the building. That's when the first strange occurrence happened. At precisely 4:38 p.m., according to my watch, I heard it, a soft metallic tinkling, like distant wind chimes. The sound pulled me into the main hall. There, in the fading light, I saw it, dozens of chains swaying gently, as if disturbed by a breeze. But the air was perfectly still. I approached one of the chains, examining it closely, finding no source of movement. When I touched it, the cold metal sent a shiver through my hand, and as soon as I made contact, the chain immediately stilled. Seconds later, it resumed its gentle swaying, matching the rhythm of all the others. I retreated to my workspace, my mind racing for a logical explanation. Perhaps it was some quirk of air circulation in the old building, I thought. Maybe the subtle shifts in temperature as evening approached created currents that I had missed. This explanation satisfied me for a moment, but I couldn't shake the strange sense of unease. The phenomenon happened again. At 5:17 p.m., the sound returned, more pronounced this time, a synchronized clanking that echoed through the building. I returned to the main hall to find the chains swinging more vigorously now, tracing identical arcs in the dim light. My scientific mind scrambled for explanations. Seismic activity. The settling of the building's foundation. Even hallucinations brought on by mold spores. None of these seemed adequate. I decided to distract myself with work, focusing on a particularly interesting collection of quarantine officers' notes I had found. As I read through these notes, I came across the first mention of nocturnal disturbances reported by staff. The head physician had dismissed these accounts as superstition among the orderlies, attributing their claims to the natural sounds of an isolated building and the psychological strain of working among the sick and dying. But at 6:05 p.m., everything changed. The third incident shattered any remaining skepticism. The chains throughout the building began to move in perfect unison, swinging in wide, deliberate arcs. The sound was no longer a gentle tinkling but a thunderous clanking that reverberated through the stone walls. I stood paralyzed, my brain struggling to process what my eyes were witnessing. There was intention in this movement. Purpose. That's when I heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps crossed the ceiling of the main hall, moving from one end to the other with slow determination. My heart hammered in my ribs, and sweat broke out on my forehead despite the evening chill. From my preliminary inspection, I knew that the staircase to the upper floors had collapsed decades ago. There was no access to the second or third floors without specialized equipment, which I had planned to bring on a future visit. Yet, the footsteps continued, moving directly overhead, stopping occasionally as if their owner was examining something of interest. Then came a new sound, one that filled me with dread, a scraping, dragging noise, as if something heavy was being pulled across the floor. Against my better judgment, I called out, asking if someone else was in the building. My voice sounded small and thin, swallowed by the rhythmic clanking of the chains. No response came. Only the continued footsteps and dragging, as if the source of the sound was far closer than it had been moments before. My mind screamed for logic, for reason, but there was none. The reality around me was slipping into something I couldn't grasp. The chains swung with a life of their own, the footsteps were undeniable, and the air itself felt charged, as though it was thick with the weight of something ancient, something waiting. I had come here to catalog artifacts, to study the remnants of a forgotten time, but now I was trapped within the very history I sought to preserve. And whatever was in this hospice, whatever had been buried for so long, was not ready to be forgotten. As I stood frozen, the chains clanging around me and the steps continuing overhead, I realized that I might not be alone in the dark after all. And I was beginning to understand, sometimes, the dead do not rest. They wait. Gathering what little courage remained, I approached the ruined staircase. The steps had collapsed into a pile of rotting timber, but in the beam of my flashlight, something caught my attention, fresh marks on the rusted handrail. Bright, deliberate scratches marred the oxidized metal, as if something had been dragged up the impossible stairway, leaving behind traces of its passage. The marks were spaced at regular intervals, as though this unknown entity had walked, or perhaps crawled, over the staircase. My mouth went dry. My legs felt weak, as though the very sight of these marks had drained the strength from my body. Every instinct screamed for immediate evacuation, but the rising tide made that impossible. I was trapped here with whatever walked the upper floors. A chill of fear ran down my spine as I retreated to the physician's office, barricading the door with a heavy desk. Through the small window, I could still see the main hall. The chains continued their synchronized dance, moving as if they had a life of their own, stretching and twisting in the still air. I tried using my satellite phone to call for emergency evacuation, but of course, no signal reached through the thick stone walls. I could feel the rational part of my mind grasping at straws, searching for explanations. Perhaps another researcher had found a different access point to the upper floors. Maybe local teenagers had been sneaking into the abandoned hospice, causing disturbances for fun. But none of these explanations accounted for the impossibility of the moving chains or the marks on a staircase no one could climb. As night deepened, so did the manifestations. The temperature in the building plummeted, and soon my breath was clouding in front of me like fog. The chains, though, began to twist and writhe, their movement now resembling something alive, each link stretching and reaching as if searching for something. The footsteps multiplied. No longer one set, but many. They moved between rooms upstairs, deliberate, purposeful, and unmistakably real. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I huddled in the corner of the office, flashlight clutched in a death grip. I turned on my voice recorder, documenting everything, every movement, every sound, every sensation. If nothing else, there would be a record of what transpired here. I found myself wondering about the quarantine officer whose notes I had been reading earlier. Had he experienced these same phenomena? Had he too dismissed them as nothing more than superstition, until confronted with undeniable evidence? At midnight, the footsteps changed direction. They no longer moved across the upper floor, they began to descend. My entire body tensed as I heard them reach the landing where the staircase had collapsed. Logic dictated they should stop there, trapped by the missing stairs. But they didn't stop. Step by step, they continued to descend the non-existent staircase. The dragging of chains echoed, filling the room with a grinding, metallic sound. Through a crack in the barricaded door, I watched in horror as the chains in the main hall parted like curtains, creating a path from the collapsed staircase to the center of the room. What emerged from the shadows defied description. Not because it was incomprehensible, but because there was nothing to see. The footsteps entered the main hall, heavy and deliberate, yet there was nothing visible to make them. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something substantial, but there was no body to account for it. Dust particles scattered in the air, disturbed by movement, but the room remained eerily empty. The chains nearest to this invisible presence began to rise from the floor. They lifted, as if gathered by unseen hands, twisting together to form what looked like a crude harness or restraint. As they assembled, I noticed dark stains on the links, old, brown, but glistening wet in the flashlight's beam. My academic mind, even in the grip of terror, connected the pieces. The quarantine measures had never been just for luggage. In the worst outbreaks, when isolation rooms filled beyond capacity, desperate staff had sometimes used chain harnesses to restrain the most dangerous patients, those in the throes of delirium or violent fever. The chains had been used to keep them from harming themselves or others, suspended from the ceiling to maximize the limited floor space. But this practice was never mentioned in the historical records. It was too brutal, too medieval to acknowledge in official documentation. But here it was. The evidence, assembling itself before my eyes. A sound filled the hall then, one that I can't describe as anything but raw, visceral, a deep, labored breathing, like someone fighting to draw air through fluid-filled lungs. It circled the room, stopping at each hanging chain, inspecting them as if searching for something specific. When it approached the office door, I stopped breathing entirely. The handle jiggled. The wood creaked as something pressed against it. My heart hammered in my chest as the chains continued their slow, deliberate movements. I could hear the breathing, feel it, as though the very air in the room had become thick with the presence of something ancient, something alive. I could sense it, whatever was behind that door, whatever had been haunting this building for over a century, was no longer satisfied with just watching. It wanted to come in. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep it out. My barricade shifted slightly, the heavy desk scraping across the floor before the pressure ceased entirely. For the long hours until dawn, I remained frozen in the physician's office, trapped with whatever was haunting St. Augustine's. The presence roamed the building, its movements unpredictable, sometimes above, sometimes below, as the chains continued their eerie, rhythmic dance. At intervals, they would twist and reassemble themselves into those horrific harness shapes before collapsing lifelessly once more. The temperature fluctuated wildly, an unnatural cycle that left me drenched in sweat. One moment, the room was freezing cold, as though winter had descended suddenly, the next, it felt stiflingly hot, like feverish heat that pressed against my skin. The air felt alive, charged, as if it was responding to some unknown presence. When the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, the phenomena ceased as abruptly as they had begun. The chains hung motionless, no longer twisting and swaying. The footsteps fell silent. The oppressive presence that had filled the building receded, leaving behind an eerie calm, like the retreating tide around the island. I waited until full daylight before removing my barricade. The main hall appeared unchanged, but there was one detail that stood out, a detail I couldn't ignore. The floor beneath the chains was marked with dozens of wet footprints, clearly fresh, as if something had moved through the hall during the night. I watched in stunned silence as the footprints evaporated in the morning light, leaving no trace. They were gone in an instant, as though they had never been there at all. The boat returned at 8 a.m., as scheduled. The operator seemed surprised to see me waiting on the dock, my bags packed, my research incomplete. He asked if I would be returning to continue my work, but my throat closed around the lie I tried to tell. Instead, I simply shook my head, and that was all. Before I left, I took one final photograph of St. Augustine's. When I developed the image later, it showed the hospice as I had seen it, except for one thing. Hundreds of dark figures hung suspended from chains in every window, their features obscured but their suffering unmistakable. The figures, the shadows, stared out at me from the photograph, frozen in a moment of endless torment. They were there, lingering in the space between the past and present, their silent cries woven into the fabric of the building itself. I couldn't escape them, even in the photographs. And so, I became obsessed. I began to research St. Augustine's further. I sought out sealed medical records and personal journals of former staff, desperate to understand what had happened in that place, what had driven it to the edge of madness. What I uncovered suggests that the official mortality figures from the quarantine period were dramatically understated. During a particularly virulent yellow fever outbreak in 1872, the staff had been overwhelmed by the number of patients. Those deemed beyond saving were moved to the upper floors, where they were restrained, left to die, abandoned to conserve limited resources for those with a better chance at survival. The historical records never mentioned this. It was too brutal to acknowledge, too medieval to include in official documents. But there it was, the truth, hidden in the margins of the past. I petitioned the Historical Maritime Preservation Society to permanently seal St. Augustine's, citing concerns about the building's structural integrity. But my true motivation remained private. Some things should remain quarantined. Some sufferings should be acknowledged, but never disturbed. But in my darkest moments, when sleep eludes me, I hear again the synchronized movement of chains. The scraping sound, the dragging sound, the sound of something trying to reach out. I wonder, are they reaching out for help? For acknowledgement? For company? And I wonder, too, what might happen if I return to that island, not as a researcher, but as a witness to a suffering that refuses to end. Sometimes, I think I already know the answer. The chains I photographed have begun to sway ever so slightly in the images. Just enough to notice if you look closely. Last night, I dreamed of climbing an impossible staircase, dragging something heavy behind me. The weight of history. The weight of what had been left behind. Story 5, The Seismic Unseen. The old rock shelter felt different tonight. I'd spent countless evenings monitoring seismic activity in this remote corner of Black Ridge National Park, but something had changed in the air. Maybe it was the unusual barometric pressure drop, or perhaps the way the wind whispered through the ancient igneous formations outside, less a sound and a vibration that seemed to press against my skin. My name is Daniel Reeves, and I'm a volunteer geologist with the USGS. For the past 6 months, I have been cataloging minor tremors in the area, mostly 1.6s on the Richter scale. Vibrations so subtle that only our sensitive equipment could detect them. But tonight, something was different. The Park Service had granted me use of a natural rock shelter, a shallow cave reinforced with stone walls erected by the CCC in the 1930s. I had grown fond of the solitude here, the quiet communion with the stone and earth. It was a place of peace, a sanctuary for my work. At the back of the shelter was a small storage closet, where the park rangers kept emergency supplies and maintenance equipment. But tonight, as I set up my equipment under the dim light of my LED headlamp, something in the shadows seemed to linger longer than it should have when I turned away. A subtle shift in the air. A presence. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was as though the rocks themselves were aware of my presence. The stillness of the night was too quiet, too unnatural. I tried to focus on my work. I had data to collect, tremors to log. But there was something about the way the shadows moved, something that unsettled me. The wind outside howled through the mountains, but here, inside the shelter, the air was still. Too still. And that was when I heard it, the first faint sound. A scraping, faint but distinct, coming from deeper within the cave. I needed fresh batteries for my seismograph. As I rummaged through the dusty shelves, my fingers brushed against something cold and smooth. It wasn't plastic or metal. It was glass, oddly textured, and it seemed to absorb the light from my headlamp rather than reflect it. Intrigued, I pulled it out, a lantern unlike any I'd ever seen. Its body was made from what appeared to be obsidian, but not the glossy volcanic glass I was familiar with. This was different. It was matte black with a strange, almost organic sheen, as though it had been forged rather than crafted. A small brass plate on its base read, "Forged from the sands of Mat Pelam, 1897. I knew Mat Pelam well. It was the dominant volcanic peak in this range, dormant for centuries but still a geologically significant landmark. Curiosity got the better of me. The lantern had a simple oil chamber and wick arrangement, and to my surprise, it was still filled with fuel. The brass ignition switch felt warm under my thumb, almost body temperature, despite the chill of the storage room. I flicked it, and the wick caught immediately. But the flame wasn't right. The fire burned a deep amber color, steady and without flicker, as though frozen in time. When I held it up, the beam it cast was unlike any light I'd ever seen. It created a perfect circle of amber illumination. But within that circle, the rocks and tools of the shelter simply vanished. Not illuminated, not cast into shadow, but rendered into a peculiar absence, as if the light erased them from existence. I swept the lantern across the far wall. The stones disappeared in its light, replaced by what I can only describe as negative space, an inversion of shadow. And within that negative space, I saw them for the first time. Silhouettes, warped, semi-melted, writhing against a brightness that shouldn't exist in the shelter's darkness. They moved like people underwater, their forms stretching and contracting with slow, deliberate motions. My heart slammed against my ribs, and the first surge of adrenaline flooded my system. Sweat broke out across my forehead, despite the cool air of the shelter. The image flickered, disappearing when I tried to focus directly on it. I moved the lantern away, and the wall returned to normal, just rough stone, unremarkable and solid. I convinced myself that I'd imagined it, a trick of light and exhaustion. After too many solitary nights, I returned to my work, setting up the night's monitoring equipment. But the lantern sat on the table beside me, its amber glow creating a perfect circle on the ceiling. Throughout the evening, I caught glimpses of movement within that circle. Brief contortions of form, stretching and contracting, vanishing whenever I tried to look directly at them. The seismograph remained quiet, too quiet. Normally, there would be tiny spikes throughout the night, the Earth's subtle adjustments, but the needle remained dead still. The silence of the instrumentation unnerved me more than any reading would have. 3 hours into my shift, a sudden, irrational impulse overtook me. I grabbed the lantern and directed its amber beam at my own feet. The stone floor beneath me disappeared, replaced by that negative space. But now, I could feel the difference physically. The temperature plummeted. My breath clouded the air as I exhaled, the cold seeping into my skin. The ground beneath my boots felt different. No longer solid rock, but something yielding and damp, like soil instead of stone. A low vibration began to build, too deep to hear, but I felt it in my bones, in my teeth. The seismograph's needle jumped violently, then settled into a slow, rhythmic pattern, like a heartbeat. 5 seconds later, another tremor, stronger this time. The equipment registered it as coming from directly below me, hundreds of feet beneath the shelter. That was impossible. Geological surveys showed solid bedrock extending at least 2 meters below the shelter. I stumbled backward, dropping the lantern. It didn't break, but it rolled across the floor, its beam sweeping over the walls. Everywhere the light touched, the stone dissolved into that negative space. And there, in the void, the silhouettes appeared. More of them now, dozens, shapes that were humanoid, but wrong. Elongated in places, compressed in others. As if viewed through a lens that distorted space itself. My mouth went dry, my hands trembling as I backed away, the eerie glow of the lantern casting flickering shadows that moved in sync with the figures. The forms stretched toward me, their movements slow but deliberate. They were aware of me. And they were coming closer. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, like it was breathing, undulating with the same rhythm as the tremors, as though the earth itself was alive and responding to whatever I had just awakened. I realized too late that the lantern wasn't just illuminating the room, it was pulling me into it. The light was the bridge between here and there. Between the present and something older, something buried beneath the mountain. I dropped the lantern, its glow flickering as it rolled away from me, casting the cave into darkness once again. The silhouettes in the negative space began to close in, their distorted forms twisting in unnatural ways. And for the first time, I understood. This was not just a cave. It was a doorway. A doorway into a place that had been waiting for someone to open it. And I was the one who had unwittingly done so. I couldn't swallow. My throat was dry, tight with fear, and the tremors continued, now in perfect sync with my own racing pulse. This wasn't coincidence. Something was responding to me, to my fear, to my very presence. I forced myself to approach the lantern again. Scientific curiosity waged war against primal terror. With shaking hands, I picked it up, examining it more closely under the pale glow of my LED headlamp. The glass wasn't just black. It contained what appeared to be tiny amber inclusions, thousands of them, shifting within the material itself. They moved like insects trapped in honey, drifting in slow, swirling currents. The park ranger who'd shown me the shelter had mentioned rumors about this place, old stories I had dismissed as nothing more than local color. He'd said the shelter had been built over the entrance to an older, deeper cave system that had been sealed up in the early 1900s after several disappearances. The official records claimed the disappearances were caused by unmarked sinkholes and treacherous terrain, but local legend spoke of thin places, where the boundary between our world and somewhere else had weakened. I had laughed at those stories then. But I wasn't laughing now. With deliberate precision, I began testing the lantern's properties. When I shone it on inanimate objects, my backpack, the monitoring equipment, the walls, everything vanished within the amber light, replaced by that negative space. But living things reacted differently. When the beam caught a spider crawling across the ceiling, the arachnid didn't vanish. Instead, it cast a shadow much larger than its actual size. The shadow moved independently of the spider itself, stretching and writhing in unnatural ways. My hands trembled so badly that I could barely keep the lantern steady. My throat constricted, and each breath felt labored, like I was inhaling cold smoke. The rational part of my brain tried to offer explanations: hallucinations from carbon monoxide, a gas leak, exhaustion-induced psychosis. But none of these could explain the seismograph's impossible readings, which continued to pulse in their erratic pattern. Desperation overtook me, and I tried calling out on my satellite phone. No signal. Not even the faintest flicker of reception, though I'd had perfect service earlier that evening. I was completely alone with whatever was in that shelter. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I made a decision. I was going to conduct one final experiment. I stood before the small mirror I kept for grooming and held the lantern at arm's length, directing its beam at my reflection. What happened next defies rational explanation. My reflection vanished, replaced by a figure that was both me and not me. It had my general dimensions, my posture, but lacked any distinct features. Behind this distorted version of myself, the space stretched impossibly. What had been the narrow shelter expanded into a vast, underground cathedral, with stalactites hanging from heights lost in darkness and massive columns of stone rising from an unseen floor. The ground shook violently. The temperature dropped so sharply that frost formed on my equipment. My ears popped with a sudden pressure change as though I had descended thousands of feet in seconds. And the figure in the mirror, the not me, lifted its arm and pointed to a spot behind my left shoulder. I whirled around, still holding the lantern. Its beam illuminated the back wall of the shelter, but the stone was gone. In its place was a passage, one that couldn't exist. Beyond it, the silhouettes gathered, more of them now, their forms unmistakably focused on me. They made no move to approach, but their attention felt like a physical force, pressing against my consciousness. One of the figures detached from the group and drifted closer to the threshold between their space and mine. Its form was more defined than the others, a suggestion of a head and shoulders, limbs that were almost human but jointed wrong, elongated beyond natural proportions. It extended what might have been a hand, beckoning me closer. My body responded before my mind could process what was happening. I backed away, stumbling over my own feet, sending my equipment crashing to the floor. The lantern flew from my grasp, landing on its side, the beam now pointing at the ceiling. A heartbeat of silence passed, and then the earth convulsed. This wasn't like any earthquake I had ever experienced. The ground didn't simply shake. It pulsed, contracted as if the stone itself was breathing, inhaling and exhaling in rhythm with the shaking. The rock beneath my feet seemed to flex and bend, shifting in time with the earth's strange heartbeat. The walls of the shelter cracked, the sound like thunder from all directions. The passageway I had seen in the beam of the lantern began to expand, stretching outwards as though it were alive, opening into something far larger than I could have possibly comprehended. The air became dense, pressing in on me from all sides. I wanted to scream, but my throat was too tight. My mind was consumed with one overwhelming thought: I had opened something I was never meant to open. And now, the ancient darkness beneath Black Ridge had begun to wake. The walls of the shelter buckled inward, not cracking but warping. The solid rock behaved like fabric in a wind, bending and twisting under an unseen force. The seismograph went wild for 3 seconds, the needle jerking back and forth in chaotic patterns before it died completely, the power generator failing in an instant. My body surged with panic. I lunged for the lantern, driven by an irrational certainty that I needed to turn it off, to break the connection it had established with whatever lay beneath the mountain. As my fingers closed around the cold, smooth glass body of the lantern, another tremor knocked me to my knees. The brass plate caught my eye once again, forged from the sands of Mount Pelham, 1897. But now, beneath it, additional text had appeared, etched in delicate, invisible hands. The glass remembers what it once was and what lies beneath. My hands trembled as I twisted the valve, cutting off the fuel supply. The amber flame sputtered and died, leaving behind an eerie stillness. The effect was immediate. The temperature began to normalize. The tremor subsided, and the walls solidified, returning to ordinary stone. In the sudden darkness, I fumbled for my flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest, breath coming in ragged gasps. My shirt was soaked with cold sweat. When I finally managed to get the light on, the shelter was exactly as it should be: no passages, no negative space, no eerie silhouettes, just solid rock, my equipment, and the quiet of the mountain night. The lantern in my hands, however, looked different now. Older, more weathered. The glass was cloudy, cracked in places, as though it had aged decades in the brief time I'd been there. I spent the rest of the night huddled by the entrance, watching the lantern, too afraid to sleep yet too exhausted to leave. It felt as though time itself had distorted in that place, and I was trapped in a loop that would never end. I could still hear the faint echoes of those footsteps from upstairs, feel the weight of something pressing against me, just beyond my reach. When dawn finally broke, I packed my essentials, wrapping the lantern carefully in my spare clothes. The park rangers would be changing shifts soon, and they'd think I was crazy if I told them what had happened. So I decided to say nothing, not yet. I would take it to the university for analysis, though part of me already knew no scientific instrument would explain what I had experienced. As I walked down the trail toward the ranger station, a massive tremor shook the mountainside. It was the first seismic event large enough to be felt without instruments in over 50 years, according to later reports. Trees swayed violently, rocks tumbled down slopes. I dropped to the ground, covering my head as the earth shook beneath me. When the shaking finally stopped, I looked back toward the shelter. A cloud of dust rose from its location. Even from a distance, I could see that part of the structure had collapsed. Where my monitoring equipment had been stationed, a dark opening now gaped in the earth, a passage revealed by the tremor, leading down into an impossibly deep darkness. From my backpack, muffled by layers of clothing, came a faint amber glow. The lantern had reignited itself. I'm writing this from a motel 30 miles from the park. I've sealed the lantern in a lockbox designed for transporting geological samples. Tomorrow, I'll take it to the university for analysis, though part of me knows no scientific instrument will ever explain what I experienced. The brass plate on the lantern had said it all: the glass remembers. I think I'm beginning to understand what that means. Sometimes, when everything is quiet, I feel the floor beneath me shift slightly, as if adjusting to a weight far below. And in those moments, I swear I can see, just from the corner of my eye, a tall figure with long limbs, watching, waiting, beckoning with its long, distorted fingers. The lockbox sits in the bathtub, wrapped in towels. Even through its secure walls, I can see a faint amber glow seeping through the cracks, growing stronger with each passing hour. And I know, deep down, that it's only a matter of time before it calls to me again. Story 6, The Textile Mill's Whisper. The moment I stepped into the abandoned textile mill, my calibrated instruments failed me. Digital gauges flickered, then died. Analog needles swung in erratic half-circles before settling on impossible readings. 23 years as an industrial electrician had taught me to trust my equipment. But standing before the massive steam boiler rising like a metal monolith from the factory floor, something primitive inside me whispered that this job would defy all technical knowledge. The air hung thick with dormant energy, not electrical current, but something more fundamental and unnerving. My footsteps echoed through the cavernous space as I approached the control panel, my breath forming small clouds in the unnaturally cold air. Rickman Textiles hadn't produced a single yard of fabric since 1977. For nearly 50 years, this place had been silent, left to rot in the shadow of forgotten industry. As I examined the boiler and the control panels, something stirred in the air, something I couldn't see, but I could feel. The hairs on my neck rose as the temperature dropped further. The air around me felt alive, and every breath I took felt heavier, as though the very atmosphere of the mill was pressing down on me. The strange sensation of being watched crept up my spine, and despite my professional curiosity, fear began to seep into my bones. The mill was supposed to be dead. But it wasn't. Not in the way I had assumed. There was something more beneath the surface, something that had never truly left. And it was waiting. Yet, the building felt expectant, as if it had been waiting specifically for me. The job seemed straightforward when the property developer called, recommissioned the main boiler system to prove the facility's infrastructure remained viable for conversion into luxury apartments. Simple diagnostics, basic rewiring, and controlled power restoration. 6 hours of work at most. Now, standing before the massive industrial heart of the building, I couldn't shake the nagging thought, why had the previous 3 contractors abandoned the job without explanation? The boiler room stretched before me like the interior of a mechanical cathedral. Copper pipes branched upward in complex arrays, disappearing into shadowed ceiling spaces. The main unit itself was a behemoth of 1950s industrial engineering. Standing 15 feet tall and twice as wide, with pressure gauges the size of dinner plates, it was a marvel of its time. All rivets and welded seams, built when American manufacturing stood unchallenged. But the air smelled wrong. Not the usual mustiness of abandonment, but something sharper, chemical, almost like burned cotton, though no production had occurred here in half a century. I flipped open my toolbox, retrieving my voltage meter, pressing the leads against the main junction box. Dead. As expected. The facility had been disconnected from the grid for decades. My first task was restoring the 3-phase power supply. I worked meticulously, cleaning corroded connections, replacing degraded insulation, and calibrating the distribution panel. 4 hours of concentration with only the occasional creaks of the building for company. When the final connection snapped into place, I paused before throwing the master switch. An inexplicable reluctance gripped me. Something about the building's perfect stillness felt like a held breath. I shook off the sensation. This was electrical work, not ghost hunting. The heavy switch required both hands and significant effort to engage. The system hummed to life with a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate not just through the air but through the concrete beneath my boots. The overhead lights flickered reluctantly, casting the space in a sickly yellow glow that seemed to make the shadows deeper rather than banishing them. Then, I heard it. The whistle. High-pitched and distant at first, like a train miles away, but unmistakably coming from within the boiler system itself. The sound traveled through the dormant pipes, a single note that wavered slightly before stabilizing. No steam system should make such a noise without pressure. I checked the gauges, still at 0. The sound continued, thin and persistent, almost musical in its consistency. I traced the noise to a section of piping I had just rewelded. The steel was ice cold to the touch, yet beaded with moisture that shouldn't have been physically possible without a temperature differential. As I wiped my hand across the condensation, something strange happened. The droplets didn't drip randomly. They formed precise rows, like notes on a staff. 5 perfect lines of water droplets marched across the metal surface, with larger beads positioned exactly where musical notation would place them. I blinked hard and looked again. The pattern remained impossible and deliberate. I moved my hand closer to the fresh weld I had created, and a sensation like an electric current surged through my arm. It wasn't painful, but deeply unsettling. It felt as though warm air was flowing inside my bones, following the paths of marrow. My skin prickled with gooseflesh, and hair stood upright from wrist to shoulder. The distant whistling intensified, joined by a mechanical click-click-click from deeper in the facility. I followed the sound through a doorway marked turbine room. My flashlight cut through thick shadows, illuminating massive generators in rows, each the size of a small car. What I saw defied explanation. The nearest turbine's blades were turning slowly, perhaps 1 revolution per minute, but unmistakably in motion, without power or steam to drive them. I checked the connection points. Completely disconnected. The emergency cutoffs were all engaged. No power source existed. Yet the machine turned with quiet determination, pushed by an invisible force. I approached cautiously, my flashlight beam playing across the spinning metal. A vapor rose from the housing, not steam, which would have been visible as white clouds in the cold air, but something different. The vapor was darker, like smoke, but thicker and more substantial, twisting in the air as though it had substance. It curled upward, vanishing into the shadows, as if drawn to some unseen force. The realization hit me slowly, like a sinking weight in my stomach. The turbine wasn't just malfunctioning. It was alive. Not in the conventional sense, but in the sense that something beyond mechanical engineering was forcing its movements. Something was powering it, something invisible, something far older than the factory itself. The question gnawed at me: what kind of energy was at work here? What had been left behind when this place had been abandoned? And then, like the answer to my unasked question, the sound of movement filled the space, a deep, reverberating groan, as though the entire building was waking from a long slumber. The turbines continued to turn. The air seemed to grow heavier, thick with an unnatural force that pressed against me. The factory was alive, and it was feeding on something, or waiting for something. I backed away from the turbines, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The shadows that had once been comforting in their stillness now seemed to reach for me, extending ever so slightly, like fingers brushing against the edges of my perception. The mill was not just abandoned. It was waiting for something, and I was beginning to understand that I had awoken it. The vapor was colorless, yet somehow perceptible. It carried the same burnt cotton scent that had greeted me upon arrival, only stronger now, a stifling presence that filled the air. When the vapor touched my skin, it left no moisture, but triggered that same internal warmth, like my blood was being gently heated from the inside. The property developer had mentioned nothing unusual about the facility's history. Just another victim of globalization, when textile production shifted overseas. The building had stood empty since its closure in 1977, visited only by security patrols and the occasional urban explorer. But now, as the strange atmosphere enveloped me, I found myself wondering, what had really happened here in 1977? What final production run had taken place before the doors were sealed shut for good? I retreated to the boiler room, my thoughts racing, unable to explain the turning turbine, but determined to complete the job I had been hired to do. The whistling had stopped, replaced by a low, almost subsonic vibration. I could feel it in my teeth more than hear it, a constant hum that vibrated through the concrete floor. My digital camera refused to function, the screen only displaying static. My cell phone had no bars, and even my battery-powered tools seemed weaker, as though the very energy I relied on had been drained away. The boiler needed inspection before I could certify it operational. I unlatched the main access panel, swinging open the heavy door to reveal the fire chamber inside. As my flashlight beam swept across the chamber's interior, I caught something unexpected. The walls weren't covered with the usual carbon buildup from years of coal combustion. Instead, they were etched with patterns, deliberate, intricate script that curled along every surface in flowing lines. Geometric symbols interrupted the script at regular intervals, pulsing subtly in the light of my beam. I reached out without thinking, tracing one symbol with my fingertip. The sensation was immediate, overwhelming. My consciousness seemed to split in two. Part of me was still standing in front of the open boiler, but another part of me became aware of the entire building, as if it were an extension of my nervous system. I could feel every pipe, every valve, every chamber within the structure. And within that system, something was circulating that was neither water nor steam. Something alive. My hand jerked back, breaking contact. Cold sweat drenched my shirt, despite the frigid air in the chamber. The room tilted around me, my perspective shifting in nauseating waves. I stumbled backward, desperate to distance myself from the boiler, from whatever force I had just awakened. My elbow struck a valve wheel, spinning it partially open with a metallic squeal. The effect was instantaneous. The whistle returned, no longer distant, but directly overhead, a piercing tone that seemed to drive ice picks into my eardrums. The overhead pipes shuddered violently, expanding and contracting, as if the building itself were breathing. More moisture appeared on every metal surface, forming the same musical patterns I had seen earlier, across the walls and equipment. The sheet metal walls of the boiler began to flex outward and inward, the rhythm matching precisely to the beating of my terrified heart. I had to shut down the power. Whatever connection I had triggered had awakened something inside the dormant systems, something that had been waiting decades for reactivation. I scrambled toward the main distribution panel, my vision tunneling with panic. The floor beneath me grew slick with impossible condensation, causing my boots to slide with each step. The moisture formed more patterns, not random puddles, but precise shapes, reminiscent of circuit diagrams, like the structure of an intricate machine. The whistle modulated, forming distinct tones that cycled through what I recognized as musical scales. The sound penetrated my skull, seeming to resonate with specific thoughts. Images began to flood my mind, fragmented and unclear. I saw rows of workers at massive looms, their movements synchronized to the machine's rhythms. Fabric flowing endlessly through mechanical jaws. Steam hissing through copper arteries. But something was wrong about these visions. The workers' faces were blurred, their features indistinct, as though they were veiled by something more than time. Their movements were too fluid, too perfect. Their arms connected directly to the machines, flesh and metal joined in seamless interface. I reached the power panel, the cold steel of the main breaker feeling like ice beneath my fingertips. The metal burned cold against my skin, frost forming instantly around my fingertips. I didn't hesitate. I threw the switch. The building seemed to exhale. The vibration stopped, the air grew still once again. The whistle ceased. Silence enveloped me, but it was not a comforting silence. It was the silence of a deep, dormant presence reluctantly retreating. I stood there for a long time, the chill of the room settling deep into my bones. The lantern's amber light flickered softly in my mind, even as the shadows closed in on the edges of my awareness. The mill was quiet once more, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something remained. Waiting. Watching. Always just beyond reach. As I gathered my tools, I couldn't help but wonder, what had truly been here before? What had been left behind, buried deep within the walls of this mill, waiting for someone to reawaken it? And would I ever truly escape it now that I had touched its pulse? I pulled with all my strength, but the switch refused to move, not jammed, not frozen, but actively resisting, as if held in place by an invisible force. The whistling shifted, changing to words. Not English. Not any human language. But somehow, inexplicably, I understood. The textile mill wasn't just a manufacturing facility. The fabric produced here had been a mere byproduct, a cover for something else entirely. The true product was the patterns, mathematical sequences embedded in textile designs distributed worldwide in seemingly ordinary fabrics, curtains, bed sheets, clothing. All carrying embedded information. Frequencies that resonated with the human nervous system in subtle, cumulative ways, altering the mind and body in imperceptible ways. The realization slammed into me like a wave. The fabric wasn't the product. The product was the pattern, woven into the fibers, distributed far and wide, entering homes, businesses, schools, lives. It was a system that had infiltrated society, subtly and quietly, influencing individuals across the world without their knowledge. I finally wrenched the power switch downward. The lights died instantly, plunging me into darkness, broken only by the faltering beam of my flashlight. But the whistling continued. The turbine still turned. The moisture still formed its deliberate patterns across every surface. The power had never been the true source. The electrical system had merely been a key, an unlocker for something that now sustained itself through other, inexplicable means. The air around me grew thick, almost resistant to movement. Each breath became an effort, as if I were inhaling thick syrup instead of air. My flashlight flickered, catching movement at the edges of my vision. The flat surfaces of gauge panels and metal housings rippled like disturbed water. Reflections in these surfaces showed impossible things. A factory floor fully operational. But it wasn't normal. The workers weren't fully human, nor were they machines. Biological components meshed seamlessly with mechanical systems, a grotesque fusion of flesh and gears, muscle and rivets. The scene was so wrong that it was impossible to look at for long, yet I couldn't pull my eyes away. The metal floor beneath me softened. My boots sank slightly with each step as I backed toward the exit. The entire room seemed to lose its structural integrity, solid surfaces becoming malleable and warping as though the very walls and floors were breathing with me, following my movements like curious, sentient things. The burnt cotton smell intensified, joined now by chemical odors I recognized from my electrical work: ozone, hot copper, phenolic resin. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the door handle, but it had changed. No longer metal, it felt organic under my fingers, warm and slightly yielding. I yanked my hand back, and in a moment of raw panic, I threw my shoulder into the door itself. It gave way, not with a metal clang but like thick membrane, bending to my will. I tumbled into the hallway beyond. The corridor stretched before me, illuminated by my wildly swinging flashlight. The exit sign glowed faintly at the far end, still powered by its emergency battery. I ran, feet slipping on surfaces that alternated between impossibly smooth and tacky with some sticky residue. The scent of burnt cotton and chemicals clung to the air, suffocating. Behind me, the whistling rose to a scream, harmonics layering into complex, discordant chords that seemed to hook into my spine and pull me backward. I focused entirely on the exit sign, ignoring the overwhelming sensation of being watched from every angle, every surface alive with intention. The walls around me had developed textures, shifting and writhing like fabric weaves, changing and flowing like time-lapse photography of growing plants. My flashlight beam passed through certain sections of the air, now thicker, more substantial. They seemed to leave temporary tunnels of clarity, which collapsed behind me as I moved. The exit door appeared normal, an industrial fire door with a panic bar. I slammed into it with desperate force, the bar giving way with a reassuring mechanical click. I staggered out into the cool night air, the normality of it almost overwhelming after the suffocating atmosphere inside. Cool night air rushed in, shockingly ordinary after the miasma of the factory. I stumbled into the parking lot, gasping in deep lungfuls of clean air, as though I could wash the experiences from my lungs. I turned back, half expecting to see the building transformed into some Lovecraftian nightmare of grotesque shapes and impossible geometry. Instead, it stood as it had when I arrived, imposing, conventional industrial architecture, dark windows reflecting the security lights of the parking area. Only the slightest movement behind one second-floor window suggested something unusual, a rhythmic pulsing, like slow breathing. My van stood where I had parked it. The keys were still in my pocket. Yet, something wasn't right. That pulsing, breathing motion behind the window, it felt like the building was watching me leave. Waiting for something. I didn't look back again. I couldn't. Story 6, The Mill's Echo. The moment I stepped into the abandoned textile mill, something in the air shifted. My calibrated instruments flickered, then died. Digital gauges spun wildly before they settled on impossible readings. Analog needles jerked erratically, then came to a halt. 23 years as an industrial electrician had taught me to trust my equipment, but now I found myself questioning everything. The mill's energy was wrong. Not electrical, not the usual power surges or discharges. This was something more fundamental, something that made my skin crawl. The building was still, yes, but it was filled with dormant, unseen energy. My footsteps echoed through the cavernous space as I approached the control panel, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The steam boiler stood in the middle of the room, like a mechanical monolith, covered in rust and grime, but it felt alive, like it was waiting for something, or someone, to awaken it. My breath turned shallow as I inspected the gauges and valves. The air felt thick, resistant. Each breath was harder to take. The whistling sound I'd heard earlier, faint and distant, returned. It was soft at first, a low, almost imperceptible tone, but it steadily grew louder. The turbines, once still, began to turn, slowly at first, as if waking from a long, deep slumber. But there was no power source. No steam, no electricity. Yet the turbines were turning. What had happened here? What had been done to this place? I was no longer sure I wanted to find out. I backed toward my van, unwilling to turn my back on the building. Through one of the ground floor windows, I could see the control panel I'd restored to functionality. The indicator lights flickered, each light shifting in precise patterns that reminded me of binary code or more like a signal being transmitted, perhaps even a beacon activated after years of silence. Inside my vehicle, I sat trembling, key in the ignition, but unturned. Professional responsibility warred with primal fear. My contract required me to secure the site before leaving, power disconnected, access panels closed, tools retrieved. But my equipment remained scattered throughout the boiler room, and the documentation was unfinished. The client would expect my report tomorrow, a decision to either recommend further restoration or condemn the building entirely. The building watched me through dark windows. It had been waiting almost 50 years for reactivation. I could feel that patient gaze. It could wait a few more hours for my return. The partial connectivity I'd established wasn't going anywhere. In fact, I could feel it growing stronger. A subtle pressure behind my eyes, almost like the patterns were reaching into my thoughts. Musical notation flickered at the edges of my vision. A melody I couldn't understand, but it was there, urging me back. I turned the key and pulled away, the tires crunching on gravel beneath me. But in my rearview mirror, I saw it. Soft light began blooming in the factory windows, one by one, as if they were coming to life. Despite cutting all power, the whistling had stopped. But now, in the silence of my van, I could hear something else, a soft, rhythmic clicking, perfectly synchronized with my heartbeat. It seemed to come from within me, a strange resonance I couldn't escape. Tomorrow, I would call the client. I would explain that the facility required specialized equipment I didn't possess. I'd recommend experts in industrial archaeology, perhaps hazardous materials remediation. But I wouldn't return alone. And tonight, I would burn the work shirt I'd worn inside, destroy the boots that had walked those cursed floors. But even as I formed these plans, I felt the patterns spreading through my mind. Beautiful, elegant sequences, weaving themselves into my thoughts, promising understanding beyond human limits. I couldn't shake the feeling that something still called to me, even now. Part of me was already composing reasons to return. After all, I'd left my best tools behind. There was still so much to learn about what had really happened at Rickman Textiles in 1977, and what had awakened in 2025. The patterns demanded completion. The machinery needed maintenance. The factory required workers. And somewhere deep inside me, embedded in bone and tissue, a faint whistling had begun again. Story 7, The Phantom Call. The digital readout blinked red in the darkness. 7B again. The same elevator. The same time. 3:17 a.m. My breath caught in my throat as goosebumps rippled across my skin. Maintenance had sealed off 7B 3 weeks ago after reports of mechanical failures. Yet, it called to me, night after night, from a place that didn't exist. My supervisor insisted there was no sublevel 3. The blueprints confirmed it. The building's foundation ended at sublevel 2. Yet here I was, watching the call button pulse in the control room's half-light, beckoning me down to the impossible. My job was simple: overnight elevator operator at Thornfield Towers, a luxury residential complex stretching 40 floors into the city skyline. Most nights passed in drowsy monotony, escorting late-night revelers to their penthouses, helping insomniacs transport their garbage, occasionally moving furniture for those who couldn't sleep and decided 2 a.m. was the perfect time to redecorate. The position was a relic, an architectural quirk preserved from the building's original 1930s design, though they had modernized everything else. The residents found comfort in tradition, or so management claimed. I found comfort in the solitude, in the measured predictability of ascent and descent. Until 3 weeks ago. The first phantom call came after a thunderstorm knocked out power to half the block. Emergency generators hummed to life, bathing the lobby in sickly yellow light. I was performing standard post-outage checks when the operator panel lit up. 7B, sublevel 3. My stomach dropped. Thornfield had 6 elevator banks, A through F, each with 2 cars numbered 1 and 2. There was no 7B. And there was certainly no sublevel 3. I dismissed it as an electrical glitch, a surge-induced error in the ancient monitoring system. But the call persisted, a stubborn red eye in the darkness. Following protocol for unexplained signals, I entered the override code and sent elevator 6B down to sublevel 2, the lowest floor. But the elevator didn't stop at sublevel 2. It kept going. Down, further than the building's blueprints allowed. The ride felt wrong from the beginning. The air became thick, almost resistant, like the elevator was pushing through something unseen. A low, almost imperceptible vibration started to hum beneath the floor, something mechanical, but with a strange undertone that I couldn't place. When the elevator finally stopped, I felt it before I saw it. A cold wave, like stepping into a freezer, but deeper, unnatural. The doors opened to an empty, unlit hallway. I expected the dim lights of sublevel 2, but there was nothing. Just darkness. And the faintest whisper of something, watching. Something waiting. In the silence, the elevator's door swung open of its own accord, a strange, creaking sound echoing in the stillness. No button to press. No sound to acknowledge the call. Just the thick, tangible presence of something hidden beneath the floors of the building. I stepped forward into the void. Story 7, The Countdown. The call light should have extinguished. It didn't. My supervisor, Miles, had left early that night, driven away by migraines that always seemed to arrive with bad weather. The building stood empty except for sleeping residents and myself. I could have ignored the call, logged it as an electrical anomaly, and continued my rounds. But curiosity, that primordial human failing, pushed me toward the service stairwell. The staircase to the sublevel smelled of damp concrete and industrial cleaner. My footsteps echoed hollowly as I descended past sublevel 1, the parking garage, into the dimmer regions of sublevel 2, which housed maintenance equipment and the building's massive HVAC system. The air grew noticeably cooler as I descended, carrying a metallic tang that coated my tongue. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy fire door marked SL2 stood partially ajar, unusual as it should have been secured. Beyond it lay the corridor that accessed the elevator shafts, a utilitarian concrete passage lined with numbered maintenance hatches. I made my way to where shafts 7A and 7B should have been, if they existed. Instead, I found a blank wall, just as the blueprints indicated. I chuckled nervously at my own foolishness, my voice swallowed by the subterranean silence. But as I turned to leave, the wall before me shuddered. A seam appeared where none had been before, splitting the concrete like a wound. The familiar chime of an arriving elevator sliced through the stillness. My heart hammered against my ribs as the seam widened, revealing polished metal doors emblazoned with the number 7B. The rational part of my brain screamed, warnings. Buildings don't spontaneously generate elevators. Walls don't simply open. Yet, I stood transfixed as the doors parted with a soft pneumatic sigh. Inside waited a perfectly ordinary elevator car, same walnut paneling, same brushed steel fixtures, the same mirror on the rear wall that adorned every elevator in Thornfield Towers, except for the control panel, which displayed buttons for 40 above-ground floors, 2 sublevels, and a third button marked SL3. My finger hovered over the sublevel 3 button, trembling slightly. I could still walk away. Reported as a hallucination induced by sleep deprivation. Request time off. But instead, I stepped inside and pressed the button. The descent felt longer than it should have. The digital floor indicator moved from SL2 to a blank display while my stomach lurched with unexpected acceleration. The temperature dropped precipitously. My breath billowed in pale clouds as the elevator hummed downward. A grinding noise emanated from the shaft, metal against metal. A sound like ancient gears reluctantly turning after decades of disuse. When the elevator finally stopped, the jolt nearly brought me to my knees. The doors opened with excruciating slowness, revealing the corridor, exactly as it would appear in my nightmares for weeks to come. White ceramic tiles stretched into darkness, their glossy surfaces reflecting pools of stagnant water. The puddles mirrored lights that weren't there. The ceiling above remained in shadow. No fluorescent fixtures were visible. Yet the water shimmered with a blue-white illumination, rippling occasionally, though the air remained perfectly still. Mounted on the ceiling, a large digital display flashed red numerals, 247, then 246. A countdown to what I couldn't imagine. I remained in the elevator, my body refusing to cross the threshold. The countdown continued, 2:45. 2:44, my watch read 3:24 a.m., its seconds ticking forward, while the ceiling timer marched backward. The air from the corridor carried the scent of chlorine and something else, a metallic, rusty odor reminiscent of old blood. At 07, I noticed movement at the corridor's end, a shadow elongating, stretching toward me. At 05, I heard what might have been footsteps, muffled as if underwater. At 03, the elevator doors began to close. At 0, just as the doors sealed shut, I glimpsed what appeared to be a hand reaching from the darkness. A hand in a sodden, stained white glove. The ascent seemed to take seconds rather than minutes. When the doors opened again, I stood once more in the familiar lobby of Thornfield Towers. The eerie weight of the experience hung over me like a suffocating fog. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know if I ever could. But one thing was certain, I wasn't alone in Thornfield Towers. And neither was the building. The countdown wasn't for me, it was for them. My pulse raced as I stumbled out of the elevator, checking my surroundings frantically. Everything appeared normal, marble floors gleaming under recessed lighting, leather sofas arranged in conversational groupings. The night security guard dozing at his station. But my reflection in the mirrored elevator doors stopped me cold. I wasn't wearing my standard black uniform. Instead, I was clad in an older style, a maroon jacket with gold braid and tarnished buttons. The Thornfield logo from the 1960s emblazoned on the breast pocket. The fabric appeared wet, plastered to my body, covered in rust-colored stains. I raised my hand to touch my face. In the reflection, the sleeve pulled back to reveal skin mottled with the same rusty patina. But when I looked down at my actual arm, I saw only my normal uniform, dry and clean. The elevator doors closed behind me, and when they did, my reflection normalized. I stood staring at the ordinary me, my mind scrambling for rational explanations. Exhaustion. Stress. Perhaps someone had slipped something into my coffee during my dinner break. I nearly convinced myself it had been a bizarre waking dream, until the call came again the next night. Over the weeks that followed, the pattern repeated with subtle variations. The phantom call always came at 3:17 a.m. The countdown timer always displayed different starting times. Sometimes minutes. Sometimes hours. Once, a full day. The corridor always extended into darkness. The puddles always reflected non-existent lights. And each time, the doors would begin closing just as the countdown reached 0, just as something approached from the corridor's end. Sometimes I heard whispers from the darkness, words just below the threshold of comprehension. Sometimes the water rippled with movement, as if something swam beneath its surface. Once, I noticed small items floating in the puddles, a key, a wallet, a wristwatch, identical to mine. Another time, the corridor appeared dry, but the white tiles had been replaced with mirrors reflecting infinite versions of myself stretching into the darkness. My reflection upon returning to the lobby changed too. Sometimes I appeared decades older, my hair gray, my face lined with wrinkles that disappeared when I touched my actual skin. Sometimes I wore different historical versions of the Thornfield uniform, the double-breasted coat from the 1940s, the polyester abomination from the 1970s. Always, the uniforms bore stains. Always they appeared soaked. Always they were covered in that rust-like substance that looked disturbingly like oxidized blood. I began researching the building's history during daylight hours. Thornfield Towers was constructed in 1928, originally as a luxury hotel before being converted to residences in the 1980s. The original plans called for 3 sublevels, but newspaper archives revealed that during construction, workers broke through into underground water channels that flooded the lowest level. After 3 workers were hospitalized with mysterious illnesses attributed to contaminants in the water, the developers sealed off the 3rd sublevel and redesigned the foundation. More disturbing were the elevator accidents. In 1952, an elevator car plummeted from the 30th floor, killing, I reminded myself, no deaths, severely injuring the operator. In 1967, another operator was found unconscious in a service corridor, clothes soaked, babbling about reflections that moved independently, and a timer counting down to something he refused to name. In 1984, during renovation, workers breached a sealed wall in sublevel 2 and reported finding an abandoned elevator shaft leading further down. The opening was promptly resealed, the incident buried in bureaucratic paperwork. My supervisor dismissed my inquiries. There was no sublevel 3. No elevator 7B. The call logs showed no activity during the times I claimed to have descended. The security cameras showed me standing motionless in the control room at precisely the moments I believed I was exploring the phantom corridor. When I insisted, he suggested I see a doctor. Sleep deprivation could cause hallucinations. So could carbon monoxide, which might explain why no one else experienced what I did during their shifts. But deep down, I knew something else was happening. Something far beyond what my mind could grasp. And as the call came again that night, again at 3:17 a.m., with the same countdown, the same whispers from the darkness, I knew I had only scratched the surface of something ancient and terrifying beneath the foundations of Thornfield Towers. The question remained, what was waiting for me in the sublevels? I almost believed him, until I noticed the rust-colored stains on his collar, identical to those on my phantom reflections. The same stains that had followed me through the bizarre corridors and elevators of Thornfield Towers. Last night, I broke protocol. When the call came at 3:17 a.m., I brought equipment, a digital camera, a flashlight, chalk to mark my path. The descent felt familiar now, almost routine, though my heart still raced with each floor the elevator passed. The countdown timer began at 4:19 when the doors opened onto the white-tiled corridor. I stepped out. The floor felt solid beneath my feet, the tiles cold and slightly slick. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the corridor that stretched perhaps 50 feet before terminating at a metal door. The puddles reflected my light now, rippling as my footsteps disturbed the shallow water. The smell remained, chlorine, rust, and something organic beneath it all. The camera refused to work, its screen displaying only static. The countdown continued. 345, 344. I marked the tiles with chalk arrows as I advanced, documenting my path, though there were no branching corridors, no rooms leading off, only the straight path to the door. At 1:37, I reached it. A standard maintenance door, unremarkable except for the symbol stenciled at eye level, the ancient elevator logo of Thornfield Towers, a relic not used since the 1930s. The handle turned easily under my grip. The countdown read 102 as I pushed the door open. Beyond lay not another room, but an elevator identical to the one I had left behind. Down to the wood paneling and mirrored rear wall. In the reflection stood not myself, but a line of men in successive Thornfield uniforms. Operators who had come before me, their clothes stained and dripping, their eyes hollow with recognition. The countdown hit 0:10. The men in the mirror beckon, their movements synchronized like a single entity with many bodies. 0005, the elevator car called to me with a familiar pneumatic sigh. Behind me, I heard what might have been footsteps, muffled, as if underwater. 0, I stepped inside, and both sets of doors closed in unison. The elevator ascended. When it opened, I stood once more in the Thornfield lobby. A quick glance at my reflection showed my normal uniform, dry and clean. My digital camera contained no images. Its memory card formatted as if never used. The chalk remained in my pocket, unused. Only one thing had changed. The service log in the control room now listed an elevator 7B scheduled for maintenance after reports of mechanical failures. According to the log, it had been sealed off 3 weeks ago by me. Tonight at 3:17 a.m., the call will come again. The digital readout will blink red in the darkness. 7B, and this time, I think I'll understand what waits behind the door at the corridor's end. This time, when the countdown reaches 0, I'll finally learn what happens if I stay. Story 8, The Tunnel That Changed Everything. The coldest fear isn't the one that makes you run. It's the one that paralyzes you completely. I learned this truth while driving through the Black Ridge Tunnel on a Sunday night in October. What happened in those 7 seconds of darkness changed everything I thought I knew about reality. Some nights, I still wake up tasting the acrid scent of damp coal in the back of my throat, my ears ringing with the mechanical clicking of Morse code that shouldn't have known my route. I've been hauling freight across the Continental Divide for 15 years. Veterans like me know all the shortcuts, the spots where state troopers hide and which tunnels to avoid during tourist season. Black Ridge was my secret weapon. A 4-mile mountain passage that cut nearly an hour off my Denver to Salt Lake run. Most drivers avoided it because of its reputation, narrow lanes, poor lighting, and cell reception that died the moment you entered. But time is money in this business, and I traversed it hundreds of times without incident. Until that Sunday. The schedule was tight. I had to deliver a shipment of industrial equipment by 6 a.m. Monday, which meant driving through the night. The autumn air had turned bitter as I approached the eastern entrance of Black Ridge around 2:30 a.m. The mountain loomed above, a massive shadow against the star-scattered sky. As I entered the tunnel, I didn't think twice. It had always been a shortcut, an old mountain road I knew well. I turned on my headlights, humming along with the low rumble of the engine. The familiar vibrations of the truck beneath me were the only sound, the hum of tires on asphalt a constant companion. Yet tonight, something felt off. Something hung in the air, thick and pressing. A heaviness I couldn't shake. And then, without warning, the truck shuddered. The lights flickered, and the radio crackled, static replacing the soft country tune I'd been listening to. I slammed the brake, but the truck didn't stop. The road ahead was gone. It was as if the tunnel itself had split, splitting the reality I knew, leaving behind only the dark, suffocating tunnel where even the air felt wrong. I felt something tug at my chest. Not physically, but mentally, emotionally, a pull that wrenched me forward. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was 3:17 a.m. again. The seconds stretched impossibly long as I tried to regain control of the truck. But nothing responded. The speedometer was dead. The engine hummed like it was trapped in some alternate world. Through the rearview mirror, I saw headlights, but no car, no driver, just a looming silhouette behind me that seemed to grow with every passing second. The darkness of the tunnel swallowed me whole. I was trapped. The road bent sharply ahead, the shadow growing denser and darker. The truck slowed, and then came to an eerie, unnatural stop. I wasn't alone anymore. A digital sign flashed the tunnel's temperature, 42 degrees hours, with a warning of possible fog inside. Nothing unusual. The first mile was routine. My high beams cut through the dull orange glow of the overhead lights, illuminating the curved concrete walls. 3 other vehicles shared the tunnel with me. A digital sign flashed the tunnel's temperature, 42 degrees hours, with a warning of possible fog inside. Nothing unusual. The first mile was routine. My high beams cut through the dull orange glow of the overhead lights, illuminating the curved concrete walls. 3 other vehicles shared the tunnel with me. A sedan about a quarter-mile ahead, a pickup truck even further up, and something large, probably another semi, that I could only make out as distant tail lights near the western exit. At the 1.8-mile marker, I noticed the first oddity. My radio, which had been silent since I entered the mountain, suddenly crackled to life. I expected the usual static, but instead, I heard a rhythmic series of beeps and pauses. My grandfather had been a Navy radio operator, and I recognized Morse code when I heard it. I couldn't translate the message, but something about the mechanical precision of the sounds made my skin crawl. I tried changing stations. Nothing but the same pulsing code on every frequency. The temperature gauge on my dashboard dropped rapidly. 42 degrees, or 38 degrees, or 29 degrees. The air within seconds felt too cold, and my breath began to fog in the cabin. The sudden cold penetrated my jacket, causing involuntary shivers to race down my spine. This wasn't normal mountain tunnel climate behavior. Something was happening to the air inside Black Ridge. Then came the smell. Anyone who's worked in mining country knows the distinct odor of wet coal. Earthy, sulfuric, with an underlying metallic quality that coats your tongue. But coal hasn't been mined in these mountains for decades. The scent grew stronger with each passing second. So intense I could almost taste the mineral grit between my teeth. At exactly the 2.3-mile marker, every light in the tunnel extinguished simultaneously. My headlights, the overhead fixtures, the tail lights of the vehicles ahead, even the illuminated dials on my dashboard, all gone in an instant. I've experienced power outages in tunnels before, but never one that affected the vehicles themselves. My truck's engine continued to rumble beneath me, but in a darkness so complete it felt like being buried alive. 1. I counted the seconds, gripping the wheel and trying to maintain my lane purely by feel. My heart hammered against my ribs as adrenaline flooded my system. 2. The scraping sound began, like massive claws dragging across asphalt, moving parallel to my truck, not behind or ahead, but directly beside me, where the concrete wall should have been. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic, almost like footsteps, if each foot were the size of a car. 3. The coal smell intensified until it burned my nostrils. Beneath it emerged something else, the unmistakable stench of decay, the kind that makes your stomach tighten and your throat close involuntarily. 4. The temperature plummeted further. The cold became a physical presence pressing against my skin, seeping into my bones. My teeth chattered uncontrollably as sweat froze on my forehead. 5. The Morse code from the radio grew louder, somehow continuing despite the electrical blackout. The mechanical clicking accelerated, becoming frantic, urgent. 6. Something massive shifted beside my truck. Though I couldn't see it, I felt its presence. A displacement of air, a pressure change that made my ears pop painfully, as whatever moved in the darkness stood taller than my 18-wheeler's cabin. 7. With the same suddenness that they had failed, all lights returned. The abrupt transition from absolute darkness to illumination sent shooting pains through my pupils. I blinked away tears, desperately scanning my surroundings. Everything appeared normal. The sedan continued ahead of me. The pickup truck's tail lights glowed steadily in the distance. My dashboard instruments displayed their usual readings, except for the temperature gauge, which had returned to 44 degrees temperature. I might have convinced myself I'd experienced some kind of waking dream, a micro-sleep episode perhaps, except for what I saw on the road surface to my right. 2 parallel grooves had been carved into the asphalt, fresh enough that small curls of road material still protruded from their edges. The marks ran perfectly alongside my truck, as though something massive had been dragged or had walked beside me. The tunnel's awakening. Where the lanes curved, so did the marks, maintaining a precise distance from my vehicle's path. I radioed for emergency services, but received only static in response. When I tried to call out to the other drivers using the CB, no one answered. The other vehicles maintained their speed, never slowing or showing any sign that their occupants had noticed the momentary blackout. As I approached the 3M marker, the radio crackled back to life. This time, I recognized fragments of the Morse transmission. Semi-blue, Denver, 6-way, Salt Lake. My truck was blue. I was heading from Denver to Salt Lake for a 6 a.m. delivery. The code was describing my route, my vehicle, my schedule. Information that had been determined hours ago, long before I entered the tunnel. My mouth went dry. A tremor worked its way up from my hands to my shoulders. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too exposed. I pressed the accelerator, eager to put Black Ridge behind me, but my increased speed seemed to trigger another response in the tunnel. The overhead lights began to flicker, not all at once, but in sequence, creating a strobing effect that tracked my movement westward. The Morse code accelerated again, this time translating into geographic coordinates. With growing horror, I realized they pinpointed locations along my planned route, rest stops I intended to use, the diner where I usually grabbed coffee, even the specific terminal at my destination. How could anyone know these details? I hadn't shared my exact route with dispatch. Some stops were personal preferences, decisions made on the fly. The cold that had briefly receded returned, this time from within my chest, spreading outward until my fingertips tingled with numbness. At the 3.5 m marker, I noticed movement in my side mirror. The parallel grooves in the road were changing direction, gradually angling toward my truck. Whatever had created those marks was no longer content to travel alongside me. It was moving closer. The smell of coal intensified again. Black liquid began to seep from the grooves in the asphalt, bubbling up like fresh tar, but moving against gravity, forming rivulets that flowed uphill. My eyes darted between the road ahead and the side mirror, tracking the inexorable approach of those mysterious tracks. At the 3.8 m marker, I felt the first impact, subtle but unmistakable. Something solid brushed against my trailer. The entire rig shuddered as though I'd hit a patch of rough road, but the tunnel surface remained smooth. The contact came again, more deliberate this time, a massive weight leaning into my trailer, testing its resistance. The radio screamed with Morse code now, the message changing to a single phrase repeated endlessly. You see nothing, you hear nothing, you know nothing. But I did see. In the side mirror, the trailer's metal skin began to deform. Massive indentations appeared in rhythmic patterns like fingerprints pressed into clay. The impressions moved up the side of the trailer toward the cab. Whatever created them remained invisible, but its effects on physical reality were undeniable. I abandoned all pretense of maintaining the speed limit. My speedometer climbed past 70 miles per hour, dangerously fast for the tunnel's confines. The exit appeared ahead, a perfect circle of night sky framed by concrete, just a quarter mile more. The sedan ahead had vanished, the pickup truck's tail lights no longer shone in the distance. Had they escaped already, or had they never been real at all? As I neared the exit, the overhead lights began to dim again. Not all at once like before, but gradually, as though being drained of power. The darkness pursued me, a wave of shadow rolling from east to west, gaining speed as it consumed each light fixture. In the growing darkness, I saw it for the first time, not directly, but as a distortion in the air beside my truck. A heat mirage effect bent light around something massive moving parallel to my vehicle. The shape suggested impossible dimensions. Too tall for the tunnel's height, too broad for the lane it occupied, yet somehow conforming to the space available. It rippled and shifted, occasionally solidifying enough to suggest a limb or appendage before dissolving back into transparency. The Morse code changed one final time, translating to geographic coordinates I recognized with cold dread, my home address. That was when the realization hit me with the force of a freight train: this wasn't just a phantom tunnel. This wasn't some glitch in reality. This thing, whatever it was, had been following me. Had been guiding me. All of my personal choices, the stops, the timing, my exact route, had been known before I even made them. The shadow, the presence, was not merely an entity of the tunnel. It was tied to me, to my life, to my decisions. The exit loomed closer, but the air pressure in the tunnel thickened, pressing against my chest, choking me with every breath. I could barely see through the fog that had begun to collect, swirling and dense. The world outside the tunnel seemed unreachable now. The tide of time and the hourglass. The first peculiarity revealed itself during my initial examination. As I carefully lifted the hourglass from its velvet-lined box, I noticed the sand inside was too fine, almost too smooth to be natural. It shimmered slightly under the light, like something more than just grains of dust from the world's endless passage. I ran my fingers along the edges of the glass and felt an unsettling warmth emanating from it, as if the hourglass itself were alive with a subtle, but undeniable, energy. I placed it on my workbench, intending to inspect it further the next day. But something odd happened. By the time I returned, the sand inside had shifted. The top chamber appeared to be emptier than before, the bottom one fuller, though I hadn't touched it. At first, I chalked it up to my own weariness from a long day of repairs and restorations. But the next day, the same thing happened again. More sand had moved from the top to the bottom, as though time itself were bending within the confines of the glass. Days passed, and the hourglass seemed to become more of a presence than just an object. The sand continued to shift in odd ways, sometimes reversing, as if time itself was being rewound. I tried everything I could think of, shaking the hourglass, turning it over multiple times, but it continued its strange behavior. The sand seemed to resist logic, flowing in impossible patterns that defied gravity and my understanding of the world. Then, one morning, I awoke to find a single grain of sand had appeared on my workbench, perfectly formed and impossibly sharp. I picked it up, placing it under the magnifier. As the lens focused, I realized this wasn't just any sand, it was crystal. And it glowed faintly in the darkness, casting a ghostly light that seemed to pulse with each heartbeat. It was from a different world entirely, a place where time didn't obey the laws I knew. The hourglass had begun to affect more than just my perception of time. As I spent more time with it, I noticed the world around me bending ever so slightly. Things I hadn't moved would change positions, objects would vanish, only to reappear in places I hadn't touched. I began to hear things that weren't there, whispers on the wind that carried across the shop floor. In the quiet of my workbench, the sand whispered back, its soft rustling like the sound of distant waves breaking on a shore that didn't belong to this world. I didn't know where the hourglass had come from, nor what force it contained, but I knew I had made a grave mistake in purchasing it. Time, in all its infinite progression, was no longer something I could hold, something I could simply restore with my tools. The hourglass had changed everything. The sand continued to spill in impossible ways. It moved on its own, creating loops, circles, and spirals that I could not trace. One evening, I was working late, and the grains seemed to rearrange themselves faster than I could watch. The entire surface of the glass became a fluid, flowing pattern of movement. It wasn't just an object anymore, it was a portal. Something was trying to break through. The strange feeling of being watched returned. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. But as the days passed, it grew stronger. It wasn't just the sense of a presence, it was the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting for the hourglass to finish its work. Something that existed outside of time, something older than the materials that created the vessel itself. That night, I saw something I could not explain. I was standing by the window, looking out over Blackwater Harbor when the reflection in the glass caught my attention. For a moment, I didn't recognize myself. My face, while still mine, appeared aged, cracked with lines like the surface of an ancient stone. And behind me, in the reflection, the shop floor seemed to ripple like water disturbed by an unseen force. I turned around quickly, but nothing was there. When I looked back at the window, everything was normal. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just glimpsed something, or someone, that shouldn't have been there. The hourglass was in the corner of my eye, its sand now completely still, as if waiting. Waiting for me. Then, it happened. I reached for the hourglass to inspect it, and in that moment, the world around me paused. Everything halted, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the back room, even my own breathing. I reached out to touch the hourglass, and as my fingers brushed against it, I was pulled into a vision. I saw the hourglass in a time far older than mine, resting in the hands of an ancient figure whose face was obscured by shadows. This figure stood in a place unlike any I had ever seen, surrounded by strange, shifting lights and dark landscapes that stretched into infinity. The figure spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but the words seemed to pulse through me, embedding themselves in my mind. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the vision was gone. I was back in my workshop, the sound of my own breath returning. My heart raced as I looked at the hourglass, now utterly still. It was waiting again. Waiting for the next grain to fall. I know what I must do now. The hourglass cannot stay here. It cannot remain in my hands, for it is no longer simply a timepiece. It is a harbinger of something much older, something that wishes to cross the boundaries of time. And it is waiting, for me to complete its cycle. The source of the sound was unmistakable. The floorboards, once solid and dry, seemed to ripple with the rhythm of the ocean. I rushed to the workbench, and there it was, the hourglass. This time, the sand had taken on an eerie quality, glowing faintly in the dim light of the flashlight. It shimmered in hues of dark blue and deep indigo, like a stormy sea reflecting an alien sky. The coastline depicted inside the hourglass had changed once again. This time, it wasn't just Cape Cod or Marblehead, it was an unfamiliar stretch of coast entirely, jagged, and unrecognizable, but hauntingly real. The sound of the waves, now more pronounced, had stopped me in my tracks. I stood there, listening. The tide wasn't just an auditory illusion, it was as if the waves were actually rolling beneath my feet. The floor beneath me began to groan, wood creaking under a weight that wasn't physical, but something far older. I stumbled back as the floor seemed to buckle and shift, the sound of rushing water intensifying. The once stable structure of my home felt as if it were dissolving into something else, something from another world. Panic clawed at me, but the fascination with the hourglass held me in place. The sand swirled in slow, deliberate patterns, the landscapes shifting in real time. It was as though the hourglass was charting my memories, each grain of sand a moment in my life, pulled from the depths of forgotten tides. My childhood summers on the beach, long fishing trips with my grandfather, all of it was being recast, written in the sand like a story that wasn't entirely mine. The air grew colder, the humidity rising as if I were standing at the edge of the ocean, but I had never been this close to the water before. The sand seemed to pulse in the glass as if breathing. I reached out, hesitated for a second, and then grasped the hourglass, feeling the strange energy coursing through it, through me. As soon as my fingers closed around the cool glass, the air shifted, and the sound of the waves became deafening. I spun around, half expecting the room to be flooded with water, but the floor remained dry. Instead, the shadows in the room twisted, taking on shapes, indistinct figures standing at the edge of my vision. They didn't seem like mere shadows, they were alive, moving with purpose, as if they were waiting. The sense of being watched, of being pulled into the hourglass's grasp, grew overwhelming. The more I tried to look at them directly, the more they dissolved into the corners of my vision, always there, just out of reach. "Who are you?" I whispered to the figures, though I knew I would receive no answer. The hourglass answered for them. The sand, now moving faster than ever, began to form another coastline, one that I had never seen before. This one was dark, made of sharp black stones and surrounded by tumultuous waters. As the tide rose higher in the sand, it spilled over, staining the polished oak surface of the workbench with dark streaks. The figures in the shadows shifted again, closer now, and a figure stepped out of the periphery of my vision. This one was different. It had the faintest outline of a man, tall and shadowy, yet not fully formed. Its presence pressed against me like an unspoken demand, a silent call that echoed through my chest. Without thinking, I turned back to the hourglass, and the sand, now moving erratically, poured in a wild stream. The hourglass was no longer in my hands, it hovered in midair, suspended by an unseen force, its glass turning and twisting violently. The sand inside flowed faster and faster, consuming the landscape, transforming it into a dark ocean. The shadows around me started to ripple like water, their edges becoming fluid and bending into one continuous mass. The entire workshop felt as if it were being pulled beneath a great weight. And then, in an instant, the shadows erupted. The hourglass shattered in my hands, the glass fracturing into 1,000 pieces, but instead of falling to the floor, the fragments hung suspended in midair. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by a sensation of sinking. My heart raced as the air around me thickened, and the figures in the shadows grew more distinct. They were not people, not even shadows. They were something else, something ancient, as old as the tides themselves. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation of drowning receded. The workshop was still, the hourglass gone, and the figures in the shadows had faded back into nothingness. I was alone, but the air felt different. The sand had left a mark, but not in the way I had expected. My workshop remained untouched, but I knew now that it wasn't just the hourglass that had been altered. Had opened something. A door, a passageway, something that had been hidden for centuries, and in the process, I had learned the true nature of time. It was no longer a simple measure of hours and minutes, it was a force, a current that could pull at the fabric of reality itself. I had seen it, touched it, and now it had touched me. There would be no going back. The face was unmistakably human, yet distorted in a way that made my stomach twist. It wasn't a simple likeness, this was something far deeper. The features were exaggerated, elongated like a reflection in a warped mirror. Eyes wide open, staring directly into my soul, a mouth twisted in silent agony. The sand moved, ever shifting, to form emotions that I could feel in my bones, fear, desperation, hopelessness, raw and visceral. I reached out, trembling, to touch the hourglass. The sensation was electric, as though the glass itself was alive and responsive to my touch. The moment my fingers grazed the surface, I was overwhelmed by a surge of images. Not just visions, but memories, memories that weren't mine. I saw the same coastline I had known so well, but this time, it was engulfed in a storm. Waves crashed against jagged rocks, and a ship struggled against the violent current. I saw the sailors, drenched and desperate, clinging to life as their ship was torn apart by the sea. In the midst of the chaos, there was one face, staring back at me through the storm. The face from the hourglass. I recoiled, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. The air grew thick, stifling, as if the very walls of my workshop were closing in on me. The room felt like it was shrinking, the boundaries of reality blurring, becoming fluid, as if time itself was warping in response to the hourglass's presence. I gasped for breath, my heart racing in my chest. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving me panting in the stillness of the room. The hourglass sat silently before me, its sand once again swirling in a mesmerizing, hypnotic pattern. But something had changed. The sand now formed images of faces, hundreds of them, some familiar, others not, staring out from within the glass. Their eyes followed me, their gazes intense, pleading, and all too real. I backed away, my mind reeling. The whispers began, faint at first, but growing louder, like a chorus of voices carried by the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt their urgency, their call for help. It was as though the hourglass was a conduit, a portal to something beyond time, drawing me into a world where past and present collided. The workshop around me seemed to distort. The walls began to bend, and the floor trembled beneath my feet. I looked down at the hourglass, but it wasn't there anymore. Instead, I saw the same ocean, the same shipwreck, and the same face, only now they were etched into the very fabric of my reality. The sand, the storm, the faces, they were no longer confined to the glass. They were part of the world I inhabited now. The cold, damp air from the sea enveloped me, the scent of salt water and decay filling my lungs. The tide began to rise, flooding my workshop, but the water wasn't just physical. It was deeper than that, seeping into my consciousness, pulling me toward the ocean, toward the storm, toward the ship that had been lost to time. I couldn't move, couldn't escape. The voices grew louder, the faces in the sand more desperate. I was no longer in my workshop, I was on the ship, in the storm, lost in the tumultuous sea. The water rose higher, swallowing me whole, but as it did, I felt a strange sense of peace, as though I was returning home, to a place I had always belonged. And then, just as the water reached my chest, the world went silent. The storm, the faces, the ocean, they were gone. I was back in my workshop, soaked to the bone, gasping for air. The hourglass was there, still on my workbench, but the sand had settled. The face had disappeared. The storm had passed. I looked around, dazed, unsure of what had just happened. The clock on the wall read 3:17 a.m., just like the previous nights. But something had shifted. I felt different, changed. The hourglass had done something to me, something I couldn't explain. I knew, deep down, that I was no longer just a man who repaired timepieces. I was connected to something much older, much darker. I sealed the hourglass away, locking it in a cabinet that I knew I would never open again. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can feel it. The pull, the call from beyond time. It's waiting for me, for all of us. And I know that one day, I will return to it, and when I do, it will have something else to show me. As I stared at the reflection, something felt off. The rust-colored coverall in the reflection seemed oddly familiar, but not in the way that made sense. My fingers tingled as I reached out, but my reflection, my doppelganger, did not mirror my movement immediately. I watched as my reflection hesitated, then slowly raised its hand, but there was something dark behind its eyes, something that didn't belong. The figure seemed to smile, but it was a smile that twisted, distorting my own features into something strange, something foreign. The pulse behind the glass grew faster, almost frantic, a rhythmic beat that seemed to echo through the very core of the building. I felt the ground beneath me shift subtly, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The temperature dropped sharply, and the familiar summer heat was replaced by a biting chill that crawled under my skin. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest, but my eyes were still locked on the glass. The office inside the reflection continued its chaotic dance. Papers fluttered and swirled like a storm, yet the air around me remained still. I had to leave. There was no other choice. I reached for the control panel on my platform to ascend, but just as my hand brushed against it, the radio crackled to life. Marco's voice came through, though it sounded distant, as if coming from underwater. "Daniel," Marco's voice echoed faintly. "Did you see it? It's happening again. We've been watching the tower from the ground. The reflection, it's changing. It's not just a mirror. Something's inside it." I froze. The ground below me began to vibrate. A low hum resonated through the structure, vibrating my teeth. I glanced back at the window, but it was no longer just an office reflected in the glass. Instead, the scene shifted. The office was gone, replaced by an endless abyss of shifting colors and shapes, too complex for the human eye to process. The chaos was no longer contained. It was breaking free. I had to get out. But as the platform moved upward, the reflection in the window followed. It wasn't just a mirror anymore. It was a doorway. 2 hours 24 minutes and 56 seconds, I staggered, barely managing to stay on my feet as the platform rocked beneath me. The sudden motion snapped me out of the hypnotic trance that had gripped me, and I quickly steadied myself, shaking off the disorienting effects of the window's pulsing energy. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tore my eyes away from the cracked glass. But even as I looked away, the sensation of being watched didn't fade. I forced myself to continue my work, glancing nervously at the other windows as I moved to the next one. The weight in my chest remained, and the air felt thick with something unspoken. The other windows didn't hold the same strange presence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the building itself was somehow alive, aware of my every movement. Minutes passed, but I didn't relax. When Marco called me again, his voice seemed distant, as if muffled by the growing pressure in the air around me. "You okay up there?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. I hesitated before responding, the words coming out in a strained murmur. "Yeah, just marking windows." I didn't mention the crack or the reflection. My mind raced, torn between the need to escape the building and the strange compulsion to uncover the mystery of what I'd seen. As I continued my inspection, I couldn't ignore the pull of the window from earlier. Its distorted reflection, the symbols, the unsettling pulse. It was as if something from behind that glass had burrowed its way into my thoughts, infecting my mind with a terrible curiosity. I finished my rounds as quickly as I could, marking each window and checking for any more signs of structural damage. When I finally made my way back to the 23rd floor window, the crack had spread even further, and the glass pulsed rhythmically, matching my heartbeat. But the scene inside had changed. The office space was still there, but now the room seemed to grow darker, as if a shadow was creeping across it, slowly smothering the light. And there, in the center of the room, was the figure, my reflection, standing perfectly still, facing me. Its eyes locked onto mine, and a slow, eerie smile crept across its face. I couldn't breathe. I could feel its gaze, even though it wasn't me, and yet, it was. My reflection, but not. And for the first time, I understood. It wasn't just mimicking me, it was waiting. Waiting for something. Waiting for me to make the wrong move. The vibration in the glass grew louder, more insistent. My reflection raised its hand slowly, deliberately, pointing at the cracked window. My heart raced in my chest as I realized, it wanted me to touch it. My hand trembled as I reached for the glass, a strange compulsion guiding me forward. And then, as I made contact, the world around me shifted. The space behind the glass no longer felt like an office. It felt like an entryway. A doorway to something else. The pulse in the glass intensified, and suddenly, I wasn't standing on the platform anymore. I was standing in the middle of the room, the reflection of the office now fully surrounding me. The air was thick and suffocating, the temperature plummeting as a low hum vibrated through the ground beneath my feet. The figure in the reflection smiled again, its eyes glinting with something ancient and dark. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was a portal. As the realization settled into my mind, I felt the pull of the connection between my counterpart and myself. The energy that had kept us apart, a barrier of time and space, had now dissolved. My body seemed to hum with a strange resonance, and for the first time, I understood the true meaning of the reflection I had seen in the window. It wasn't just a mirror of my physical appearance, it was an echo of my essence, my potential, and my lost moments. I looked into my doppelganger's eyes, and for the first time, I truly saw myself, not just the person I was, but the person I could have been, the choices I had never made, and the paths I had never taken. Our hands remained clasped, and I could feel his life flooding into me, just as mine had been absorbed into him. The fusion was gradual, but undeniable. The papers that had once spun in chaotic circles slowly began to settle, falling gently to the floor as if they too were caught in the calm that had enveloped the space. The harsh, unnatural glow that had filled the room dimmed, replaced by the soft, golden light of twilight. For the first time since entering the Meridian Tower, I felt as though I was truly at peace. But the peace didn't last. As the room stabilized around us, a low rumble began to vibrate through the walls, starting from deep within the foundation of the tower. The very air seemed to thicken, and I could feel the weight of something ancient stirring beneath the building's surface, something that had been dormant for too long. I pulled away from my reflection, no, my other self, and we both turned toward the source of the disturbance. Suddenly, the walls around us began to warp, shifting as though they were being stretched by invisible hands. The structural void that had once been behind the wall seemed to collapse inward, revealing a cavernous space that shouldn't have existed in the middle of the tower. The furniture inside began to tremble once again, but this time, the movement was not random. It was controlled, purposeful. As though the room was coming alive, aware of our presence. I glanced at my reflection, or, now, my counterpart. We shared the same look of realization. This wasn't just a building, it was a nexus, a focal point for something far older and more powerful than either of us could have comprehended. We had been drawn into its orbit, not by our own will, but by forces we had only begun to understand. Without speaking, we moved toward the center of the room, both drawn to an object that had materialized from the shifting walls, a large, blackened stone disk, half buried in what looked like a sea of sand. Symbols, intricate and impossibly old, were etched into its surface, glowing faintly with a light that seemed to pulse in time with our hearts. It was a symbol of convergence, a binding of time, place, and person. My counterpart stepped forward, his hand reaching out to touch the stone. I hesitated for a moment, but something within me urged me to follow. Our fingers brushed against the stone simultaneously, and as soon as we made contact, the room around us exploded with blinding light. For a brief moment, I lost all sense of self, as if time had become irrelevant, as if I had been torn apart and woven back together 1,000 times. My mind swirled with images of countless lives lived in parallel worlds, choices made, paths taken, and those never reached. It was overwhelming, but beneath it all, there was a deep sense of understanding. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The light dimmed, and the room fell into a profound silence. My counterpart was gone, vanished as though he had never existed, and yet somehow, I felt complete. I could feel his presence inside me, as if we had merged into one being. The tower was still. The walls were no longer shifting. And for the first time, I felt a connection to the Meridian Tower itself, not as a structure of steel and glass, but as an entity in its own right, a place where boundaries between realities had always been thin, waiting for the right moment to breach. But that moment was over. I stood alone in the room, the air heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The building was silent, but I knew it would not remain so for long. Something had shifted, and the Meridian Tower was no longer just a place, it was a passage. A gateway. And now, I understood that I had crossed into something far greater than myself. I turned to the window where I had first seen my reflection. It was no longer a simple pane of glass but a portal, a reflection of what could have been, and what could still be. The tower had made its mark on me, but I knew that the cycle would continue, and others would come to see what I had seen, feel what I had felt. And perhaps, like me, they would never leave. My hand hovered over the walkie-talkie on my belt, but something kept me from calling for backup. I should have known better. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to leave, but curiosity, that same stubborn instinct that had kept me in the firefighting game for decades, pushed me forward. I took a step toward the door, crouching to examine the smoke more closely. The white tendrils moved with intent, spreading out across the floor, curling and twisting as if the air itself was being shaped by some unseen force. It wasn't just smoke. It didn't behave like smoke. It was as though it had a purpose, no, a consciousness. It wasn't trying to escape or dissipate, it was observing, testing, learning. I hesitated for a moment, watching the smoke crawl across the carpet, and then I did something I shouldn't have done, I reached out with my hand. The smoke hesitated, as if considering me, before lashing out, a cold, dry tendril brushing my fingers with alarming speed. I pulled my hand back instinctively, but the sensation lingered. It was cold, unnaturally so, and the way it had reacted to my touch left a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. The smoke shifted in rhythm with my movement, following me as I backed away from the door. It wasn't the wind or the natural currents of the building, it was conscious, intelligent, and it was watching me. My thoughts raced as I fumbled for my radio again, this time dialing the main office to report the anomaly. But before I could speak, the smoke rose up like a wave, swirling around the room in tight, deliberate spirals. It had moved in unison with my actions, but now it had a life of its own. I stepped back further, backing away until I was near the stairs. It seemed to follow me, edging closer with every step I took. For the first time in my career, I felt that primal instinct I had long suppressed, the urge to run. But I didn't. I stood frozen, watching in disbelief as the smoke twisted and writhed across the floor, curling and bending in shapes too intricate to be natural. Then, a strange sound filled the air, a hiss, like a breath being drawn through a tight throat. The smoke seemed to condense into a single, solid shape, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, someone, standing within it. It was a fleeting vision, a silhouette of a person, but before I could process it, the form dissolved back into smoke, and the hiss faded away. I had seen enough. Whatever this was, it was beyond my expertise. I needed to get out, but I couldn't bring myself to turn my back on it. I reached for the nearest exit, my heart racing, my body on high alert. As I moved toward the door, I could feel the weight of the presence behind me, following me, waiting for me to make my move. I threw open the door and rushed down the hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent building. The smoke was gone, but the lingering sense of something wrong, something watching, remained. As I exited the building and stepped into the cool evening air, I realized that I had barely managed to escape whatever had inhabited that space. The next day, I returned to the Grand Meridian, determined to finish my job. But when I arrived, the building was locked up tight, the entire 7th floor sealed off. I called Marco and was told that the 7th floor was no longer accessible, pending further investigation of the building systems. The manager had no explanation, only vague assurances about maintenance schedules. I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew more than they were letting on. Later that week, the news broke. The Grand Meridian would be closing its doors indefinitely for structural repairs. I never returned to finish the inspection. I couldn't. But I still dream of that place. Of the smoke that crawled across the floor. Of the shape I saw within it, staring back at me with eyes I couldn't understand. Some nights, I hear that hiss again. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake to the sound of soft, deliberate footsteps following me from the shadows, just out of reach. The voice was distorted, frantic, but the message was clear. Whatever had started with the white smoke had escalated beyond containment. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get out before whatever had taken hold of the building reached me. But the footage from the security monitors, the motionless figures in the boiler room, kept me rooted in place. Their stillness was wrong, so wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer human, trapped in a frozen moment of time, part of whatever was manifesting in the building. I stood in the dimly lit security office, surrounded by the hum of malfunctioning equipment and the distant roar of unseen machinery. The air had grown colder, the temperature plummeting as the white smoke continued to snake its way through the building. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened, what I had experienced in the hotel's corridors. I took a deep breath, steadying myself as I scanned the monitors again. The smoke had now spread to the 7th floor. It moved with calculated intent, flowing beneath doors, curling around walls. And those figures in the boiler room, still unmoving, their backs to the camera, had they been turned to stone? Were they even real? Or were they just echoes of something that had once been alive, now trapped in a different reality, a twisted reflection of the building's own history? Suddenly, a burst of static shook the airwaves. The radio crackled to life again, this time louder and more distorted, but there was a single, chilling phrase I could understand amidst the chaos. Containment breach, it's coming. The voice was frantic, hurried, as if the speaker knew what was coming but didn't have time to explain. I felt my heart pound in my chest. The building felt like it was alive, breathing, changing in ways that defied explanation. The smoke, the figures, the unnatural cold that had taken over, none of it made sense, but it was real. I knew it was real, because I could feel it. I turned and bolted from the security office, my footsteps echoing as I ran down the corridor toward the emergency exit. My phone buzzed, and for a split second, I thought it might be a call for help. But when I checked it, I saw nothing but an incoming text from an unknown number. It's already inside. You're not the first. I didn't stop to think. I didn't need to. I pushed through the emergency exit door, emerging into the dark alleyway behind the hotel. The night air hit me like a wall, cold and damp. My breath came out in ragged gasps as I turned to look back at the building. The hotel loomed behind me, its once elegant facade now seemingly twisted in the darkness. The windows, all of them, seemed to pulse with a strange light from within. Not the warm glow of a living building, but something far darker. The white smoke poured from the cracks in the brick, curling toward the sky, vanishing into the night. It had moved beyond the confines of the hotel. It was reaching out. And it knew I was there. The building's history, its secrets, had been waiting for me all along. The strange behavior, the unexplained anomalies, everything pointed to one conclusion. The Grand Meridian Hotel had never truly been abandoned. It had been waiting. Waiting for something to break its boundaries. And now, it had found me. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let it follow me. With my legs shaking beneath me, I stumbled toward my car, but even as I walked away, I knew I would never escape what had begun inside those walls. The Grand Meridian Hotel was no longer a place I could forget. It had become part of me, and I was part of it. Forever. The hotel had eyes. It had a pulse. And it would always be watching. As I drove away into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't leaving the building behind. I was carrying it with me. And the hotel's story wasn't over. 2 hours 42 minutes and 22 seconds, it moved with purpose, tracing lines and patterns across the floor like some kind of map being drawn in real time. Each step I took was mirrored by dozens of glowing footprints, some fresh, some faded, as if the entire history of the hotel's tragedy was being replayed with every passing moment. The empty, vacant worker continued his task, pouring more water down the stairs, his motions becoming more frantic, like a machine operating beyond its designed parameters. I approached him cautiously, my voice shaking as I asked, "What happened? Why are you doing this?" But he didn't answer. His eyes remained hollow, his body stiff with the same eerie, mechanical precision as the smoke surrounding him. I reached out, unsure of what I hoped to achieve, when the ground beneath me trembled, just slightly, like the pulse of something beneath the hotel's foundations. The radio crackled again, the voice now louder, desperate. "We can't hold it back much longer. It's not just the building. It's us, we're the conduit. You have to stop it. You have to stop it now." I felt the weight of the words crash over me. The realization hit me with the force of a wave. The building, the workers, the phenomena, they were all connected, victims of something far more powerful than mere physics. The Grand Meridian wasn't just a building, it was a trap, a machine, a vessel that had been waiting for the right moment to reclaim what had been lost. And now, it had chosen me. As I backed away, the smoke thickened, swirling in an even more unnatural pattern, as if it were alive, sentient, hunting. The floor beneath me began to ripple like the surface of a pond disturbed by an unseen hand. Water flowed upward, twisting, pulling the smoky mist with it, creating an ever-growing vortex in the middle of the lobby. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and I felt a creeping cold seeping into my bones. The walls around me shifted, the grand marble columns warping as if they were nothing but soft clay in the hands of a malevolent artist. The air felt thick and suffocating, as if reality itself was beginning to stretch and distort. The white smoke began to coalesce into shapes, figures, shadows, and fleeting forms that moved just outside of my vision, always present, always watching. And then I heard it. A low, guttural sound that started as a whisper, but grew louder with every passing second. It was a voice, but not a human one. It sounded like something ancient, something forgotten by time itself, calling from the deepest recesses of the earth. The voice was speaking to me. Return it. Return it to the depths. The message hit me like a physical blow. I had no idea what it was, but the urgency of the command was unmistakable. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, forcing me to move, forcing me to act. My body was no longer my own, moving toward the lobby's central staircase as if guided by some invisible force. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to return whatever had been taken. But I had no choice. The building wasn't giving me a choice. The smoke continued to swirl, spiraling upward with increasing speed, as the shadows gathered more densely at the base of the stairs. The air was thick with the scent of coal, decay, and something metallic, like the taste of blood on the tongue. I reached the staircase, my feet moving on their own accord. The once grand structure felt like it was alive beneath me, its very foundation trembling with a hunger that would not be denied. As I placed my hand on the banister, I felt a shock run through my arm, as if the building was testing my resolve, testing my willingness to give in. I had no idea what was waiting for me on the other side of the threshold. No idea what I had to do to stop whatever was unfolding. But the choice had been made. The only thing left was to face it. With a deep breath, I stepped into the swirling darkness at the foot of the stairs, knowing that whatever lay ahead would either save me, or consume me entirely. And then, as I descended into the unknown, I felt a cold hand wrap around my heart, pulling me downward into the waiting depths. The air grew thick with anticipation, as if the building itself were holding its breath. The footsteps continued, now in sync with my own heartbeat, growing louder and more deliberate. I pressed my back against the cold, hard surface of the desk, trying to steady my breath, but every instinct screamed at me to run. I could feel the weight of something, or someone, approaching from behind, its presence both unsettling and suffocating. I dared not look back, yet I couldn't stop myself from glancing toward the security monitor. This time, the image on the screen was no longer me. Instead, it was a figure cloaked in shadow, its features distorted and inhuman. The figure in the monitor raised a hand, not mirroring mine, but reaching toward the door. My own reflection, my true self, stayed frozen in place, eyes wide in terror, unable to move. A cold wave of realization washed over me. Whatever was happening here, it was no longer about simple distortions in reality. This was something far older, something far more sinister than I could have imagined. The building, the corridors, the doors, they were all part of a puzzle, one that I had unknowingly walked into. The footsteps grew closer, and the labored breathing grew heavier, almost as if it was coming from within me. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice was strangled in my throat, unwilling to make a sound. Every fiber of my being urged me to leave, to escape the madness, but something stronger, the same inexplicable pull I had felt when I first stepped into the courthouse, held me there. I turned my gaze to the door in front of me. The handle twisted slowly, its motion jerky and unnatural, as if something unseen was forcing it. It opened a fraction, and a rush of cold air poured into the room, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. I froze, my heart racing as I watched the door swing wide. On the other side was not the darkened corridor I expected, but an endless field under a moonlit sky. The trees at the edge of the field stood tall and dark, their branches twisting unnaturally, reaching toward me as though alive. The air was thick with fog, and the ground beneath my feet felt soft, almost marshy, as if I were standing on the edge of a swamp. I stepped forward, compelled by some force beyond my control, crossing the threshold of the door. The moment I did, the air around me shifted. The oppressive silence of the courthouse basement was replaced by the distant sound of something, or someone, whispering in the wind. My feet sank slightly into the damp earth with each step, and the distant whispers grew louder, clearer, like voices calling out from the shadows. Come, follow. The voices beckoned. Come, and see what lies beneath. I couldn't turn back now. The door behind me slammed shut, sealing off the courthouse, the basement, the madness I had left behind. I was standing in the middle of an unknown place, surrounded by the voices of the past, the remnants of those who had come before me. Each step forward led me deeper into the unknown, where time had no meaning and the rules of reality no longer applied. As I ventured further into the mist, the field seemed to stretch on forever, the trees multiplying, until they formed a circle around me. At the center of the circle was an ancient well, its stone surface worn smooth by centuries of use. The well beckoned me forward, its dark opening a mirror of the door I had just passed through. I could feel it now, the presence that had been following me. It was here, in the mist, in the whispers, in the ground beneath my feet. The air grew heavier with each passing moment, the weight of something ancient and malevolent pressing in on me. I knelt beside the well, my hand trembling as I reached toward the edge. A single drop of water rippled outward from its surface, expanding into concentric circles, but then, something emerged from the darkness below. Not a hand, not a face, but something far more unnatural. It was a figure, clothed in the same gray shadows that had haunted the courthouse basement, now rising to meet me. Its eyes glowed with a hollow, eerie light, the same light that had once been in my reflection on the monitor. It was the same thing, the same figure that had followed me from the courthouse, through the doors, and now into this strange world. And in that moment, I understood. The building, the doors, the labyrinth of rooms, it had all been part of something larger. A force that drew in those who sought answers, who sought to understand what lay beneath. It was an entity, a being born of forgotten memories and buried truths, existing across realities and spaces. And now, it was here, with me. "Do you see now?" the figure whispered, its voice echoing in my mind. "You have walked through the door, and now you are here. Here, where time and space collide." The ground beneath me quaked, the trees trembling, their branches reaching down to touch me. The figure stepped closer, its hand extending toward me, pulling me into its embrace. I had no choice but to take it. And as my fingers brushed against its cold, incorporeal skin, I felt the last remnants of reality fade away. The field, the well, the courthouse, everything dissolved into the ether. What lay beyond the well was not a place, but a point in time, where all moments converged. And in that final instant, I understood. The courthouse had not been my destination. I had been the key all along. I opened the door cautiously, stepping into what seemed to be the outside world. The air felt normal, fresh and warm, carrying the familiar sense of city life. But as my foot crossed the threshold, I immediately felt something was wrong. The world outside was too vivid, too real, a perfect replica of everything I had left behind, but it wasn't quite right. The street sounds were sharper, clearer, and more insistent. Cars zoomed past, their headlights flashing in rhythmic patterns, synchronized with the flickering lights in the hallway behind me. I turned around, expecting to see the same corridor, the same gray walls lined with endless files. But the door had vanished. In its place was a brick wall, completely solid and seamless, with no trace of the strange hallway that had led me here. Panic surged within me. I rushed back to the street, hoping to make sense of what was happening. The traffic moved as it always had, busy, bustling, full of the noise and motion that made up the pulse of everyday life. Yet something felt off. I was aware of every detail, of the individual pedestrians, the slight tilt of the street lamps, the cars that passed by, but none of it felt real. Not anymore. I checked my watch. It read 2:59 a.m., the same time it always read when I was back in the courthouse. It shouldn't be possible. How could the same hour repeat again and again? How had I stepped into this world when I was supposed to be trapped in that basement? Or was this simply another layer of the same loop, an illusion, an extension of my endless journey through time and space? The air grew colder again, a bitter chill creeping down my spine. The sounds around me softened, muffling, as if the world were fading. I had barely time to react before I felt the presence behind me. Slowly, cautiously, I turned to see a figure stepping out from a shadowed alleyway. It was me. Or something that looked like me. The figure stood silently, watching me. There was a calm, knowing expression on its face, one I hadn't seen before. Not the terror-filled reflection I had witnessed earlier in the courthouse, but something different, more composed, almost satisfied. And behind it, beyond the figure, the world began to warp again, the buildings distorting, the sky dimming, as if the reality around us was crumbling. The figure smiled. Not in the way I would have, but in a cold, detached manner. It nodded once, as if to acknowledge something, and then the street began to fade, the sounds grew dim, and the figure's voice echoed softly in my mind. "You're always one step away from freedom, Daniel. You always have been. But the cycles continue. You cannot escape the archives." The world around me shattered like glass, the image of the street, the figure, and everything else dissolving into fragments of light. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the antechamber, staring at the 3 doors. Nothing had changed, except for the faint, dark circle of footprints that lingered behind me on the floor. I stood frozen, unable to move, feeling the weight of time pressing against me, trapping me once more. The ledger on the desk had changed too. My name was there, as always, but the entries now included additional notes, incomplete cycle, the same words written under each of my signatures, alongside a single phrase that caught my attention: "It begins again." And then, I realized. The cycle wasn't just about repetition, it was about waiting. Waiting for me to understand that I was not just cataloging time. I was part of it. Part of the very structure of the courthouse, a cog in a machine that spun without end. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of the truth settle around me. I had become part of the archive. And no matter how many times I opened the door, no matter how many times I stepped out into the world, I would always return to the same place, the same moment in time. A never-ending loop of past, present, and future, forever bound by the doors and the files. The door before me clicked open, and I stepped through, no longer fighting, no longer questioning. The cycle had always been this way. And it would always begin again. The rhythm of footsteps never fades. Even now, as I sit in my office, the sound continues to echo, ever present, ever persistent, tapping against the edges of my awareness. It's as though the archives have become a part of me, their secrets woven into the very fabric of my existence. The patterns, the cycles, no matter how far I run, no matter how many times I try to break free, they pull me back. The courthouse no longer feels like home. It feels like a stage, a place I visit between cycles, where the facade of normalcy can only hold up for so long. The faces of those around me blur, their lives distant and disconnected, like the distorted reflections I once saw in the glass. Sometimes, I wonder if they even know what's happening to me. I can't tell anyone, no one would believe the madness I've witnessed. As time goes on, I've begun to see the threads. The more I look, the more I realize that everything has been leading me to this point. There's a purpose behind the doors, behind the archives, behind the endless repetition. It's not just about filing cases or organizing forgotten evidence. It's about maintaining balance. Keeping the doors locked, the cycles moving, the boundaries intact. The archives are alive in ways I never understood. They are not just a storage of documents, but a record of time itself. The doors, the steps, the rules, they are the mechanisms that hold everything together. And me? I am both part of the system and a keeper of it. I have always been tied to it, whether I realized it or not. I can't escape, not until I've completed my role. Not until the last door has been opened, and the cycle is complete. I can feel it now, every time I try to walk away. The weight of the archives pressing against me, the knowledge that I cannot outrun what I've become a part of. Each day is just another step toward the inevitable return, when I will again face those 6 doors, the flickering lights, the endless pattern that calls me back. But for now, I have a brief reprieve. A moment of clarity in the world above. I can hear the world moving around me, feel the cold air against my skin, but there is no forgetting. The archives are always there, waiting. And when the time comes, I will answer the call, just as I always have. Until then, I will continue walking, each step falling in perfect rhythm with the last. And one day, I will finally understand why. As the nights wore on, the sound grew more intense. The vibrations moved beyond the confines of my workshop, spreading throughout the entire house, as if the frequencies were threading through the very bones of the building. I could feel them in the walls, the floorboards, even the air. The hum of the universe had infiltrated my life, and now, it felt as though it was all around me, vibrating within every object, every thought. The mirror, still in place, remained an unyielding presence in the corner of the room. Its polished surface seemed to pulse with energy, and I could not escape the sensation that it was watching me, studying me. My reflection, once benign, had grown increasingly unsettling. No longer did it simply mirror my movements, it seemed to anticipate them, as though it were learning, adapting, becoming something more. It was in one of these moments of restless watching that I noticed something I had missed before, something that terrified me more than anything else. The mirror's reflection was starting to change. My figure, always in the same work clothes, now appeared to be aging. Not just my face, but my entire body. My muscles seemed to loosen and sag, my skin growing thin and translucent, my hair graying. I raised my hand to my face, and in the reflection, I saw my reflection's hand moving too. But it was not my hand anymore. In the mirror, my reflection was touching my face with a slow, deliberate motion, its fingers tracing the contours of my face, as though it were becoming familiar with every imperfection. And then, as though in slow motion, the reflection smiled, without my permission, without any conscious thought from me. The smile was hollow, unnatural, its expression one of knowing that sent ice through my veins. I couldn't stop myself from reaching out, and as my fingers brushed the surface of the glass, the vibrations in the room shifted. The air thickened, like something heavy was pressing down on me. I stepped back, but the reflection did not move. It stood there, grinning as if it had been waiting for this moment, for my touch. I should have destroyed the mirror, thrown it out, burned it. But I didn't. I couldn't. It had become a part of me, of my life, woven into the very fabric of my existence, much like the instruments I crafted. The mirror's influence was subtle, slowly creeping into my thoughts, twisting them. It wasn't just a reflection anymore, it was a link, a doorway to something beyond. Something I didn't understand but knew was real, and perhaps far older than anything I could comprehend. That night, I had a dream, or perhaps it wasn't a dream at all. I stood before the mirror, my reflection now no longer my own, but a creature with infinite eyes, each one an orb of light, each one watching me, seeing me for what I truly was. My reflection spoke to me then, but the words were not words, they were thoughts, shared directly into my mind. It said, "You have always been a part of us. You were made to be here." I woke with a start, my heart racing. The room was silent, but the vibrations were still there, faint but unmistakable, resonating through the floor, the walls, even the very air. I went to the workshop, driven by an irresistible pull, and there it was, still hanging on the wall, the mirror. Waiting. The next day, I did something I never thought I would. I placed the Brazilian rosewood and coquelo back in the workshop. I set the mirror before me, not to avoid it, but to face it. And for the first time, I let the mirror show me everything it wanted me to see. I didn't fight it. I didn't turn away. The reflection shifted again, the galaxies of eyes, the endless spirals, pulling me in. I watched, knowing now that there was no way to escape. The mirror was not just a portal, but a part of me. A part of my soul. A part of my very existence that had been lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And in that moment, I knew the truth, the mirror had always been a reflection of something deeper than mere glass. It was a connection, a tie between worlds, between dimensions, between myself and the universe's most ancient forces. I was a craftsman, yes, but now I was something else, a vessel for the mirror's legacy. And as long as the mirror remained, I would remain, caught in an endless cycle of reflection and creation. I don't know how long I've been here. It could be days, months, or years. Time has stopped meaning much, as the boundaries between reality and reflection continue to blur. But as I continue my work, I feel the pull, the weight of the mirror's power, and the knowledge that it will never let me go. The mirror is not just a tool of reflection. It is a creator, a keeper of cycles, and as I craft each new instrument, each new piece of wood, I feel its influence, shaping my hands, shaping my mind. And I know now that when I finally leave this workshop, I will not leave alone. My reflection will walk beside me, in the world above and the worlds beyond, forever tethered to the cycle of creation and reflection. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood frozen, every fiber of my being screaming at me to leave, to escape whatever this was. But I couldn't move. The name echoed in my mind like a slow drumbeat, pounding against the walls of my skull. Daniel Matthias Kololston, a name from my past, a name I hadn't heard in years. A name I had abandoned long ago. Then, as if to punish me for my hesitation, the whisper came again. Faint at first, but then clearer, more distinct. The voice didn't seem to come from any particular source. It was in the walls, in the very air I breathed, as if the tunnel itself had learned to speak. Daniel Matthias Kololston, why did you leave? I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet, my head spinning. My pulse thundered in my ears as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The water wheel, still turning, continued to groan under the weight of its impossible motion. Each revolution seemed to draw the whisper closer, as if the wheel itself were a conduit for something far older, far more malignant. I wanted to leave. I wanted to turn around and run back through the tunnel, through the darkness, out of this place that shouldn't exist. But something held me there. An unspoken compulsion. The whisper wasn't just a voice. It felt like a summons. Do you remember? It whispered again, this time softer, but filled with an aching intensity. Do you remember why you were chosen? I felt my breath catch in my throat. My mind flashed back to the years before, to my time as an architect, to the projects I had worked on, to the urban decay I had studied so intently. But none of that felt connected to this. The tunnels, the whispers, the water wheel, it all seemed like a living thing, something far beyond the reach of logic, beyond anything I had ever encountered. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone, hoping to get a signal, to call for help, but the screen remained dark. No bars. No connection. Only silence. The same oppressive silence that now seemed to fill the very space around me, curling inward like the dark water pooling in the center of the room. The wheel turned again, slowly, steadily. The name, my name, echoed once more as the wheel passed its lowest point. Daniel Matthias Kololston, come closer. I resisted, every instinct screaming for me to leave. But still, my legs moved. They took a step, then another, as if against my will. The whisper wasn't in my head anymore, it was in my bones. It was pulling me forward, urging me to follow, to answer. I could no longer tell where the voice ended and I began. The line between who I had been and what I was becoming blurred, distorted by the ancient force beneath the city. And then I saw it. The water wheel slowed, coming to a stop. The silence was so complete that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The room shifted, changing in a way that should not have been possible. The stone walls faded, replaced by something else, something colder, darker. Shadows moved within the space, not cast by the dim light of my headlamp, but emerging from the very walls themselves, like something alive, like something waiting. I froze, a sharp gasp escaping my lips as I saw the reflection in the water. It wasn't me. It wasn't the me I knew, the man who had worked to uncover the forgotten layers of the city. No. This was something else. The reflection was a younger version of myself, wearing an expression of knowing, of resignation. And in its eyes, I saw a flicker of recognition. You know what you must do, the voice whispered, now not just in my ears, but deep in my soul. You were chosen to find the center, to understand. Come closer. The water rippled in front of me, swirling as if it was alive. And then I heard it, faint at first, but growing louder, an unmistakable sound. The creaking of an old wooden door, opening, just behind me. I turned, unable to resist, my heart thumping wildly in my chest. The door was ajar, its ancient wood groaning as though beckoning me inside. And so I went. Each step felt heavier than the last, my boots sinking into the water that was now rising around me. The darkness closed in as I approached the door, and I knew that once I crossed its threshold, there would be no turning back. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if I were walking through a tunnel of time itself. The whisper continued, guiding me, urging me forward. I entered the room, and the door closed behind me with a finality that echoed in my bones. What lay ahead, I couldn't say. But the whispers, the water, the reflection, they had all led me here. And now, I understood that whatever this place was, it was where I had always been meant to end up. The walls of the room shifted again, revealing the truth I had been seeking. The tunnels beneath the city weren't just forgotten infrastructure. They were a vessel. A vessel for something ancient, something that had waited for centuries to be uncovered. And I, Daniel Matthias Kololston, had been chosen to uncover it. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold, damp stone. The walls seemed to pulse beneath my touch, vibrating with an energy I could feel deep in my chest. The cycle had begun. And I was no longer just a man. I was a part of something far older, something eternal. The whisper came again, softer now, but filled with an eerie finality. Welcome home. The room went dark.